What's up, you two people? Shaggy the Writer coming at you live from the library. All kinds of love. We gotta start out with the shout outs. Don't watch continue. Dark Rose. Again, the World G, who will be in the building soon, I'm sure. All kinds of love just going out to Rakim. All kinds of love going out to the fine folks over at the r/alternate history hub Discord page. All kinds of love going out to Octowave. We rockin' and we rollin', and we got a bunch of time today to stream. So we're gonna stream literally 1984. Let's see though. We ready to go. We're picking up where we left off. Sorry, Three Musketeers fans. I should have streamed more of that yesterday when I had the chance, but just kind of started losing my voice. Didn't want to continue. Because unlike continue, I can't always continue. It's Chapter 4, Part 2, 1984. Winston looked around the shabby little room above Mr. Carrington's shop. Besides the window, the enormous bed was made up with ragged blankets and a coverless bolster. The old-fashioned clock, with the 12-hour face, was ticking away on the mantelpiece. In the corner, on the give-tag table, the glass paperweight which he had bought on his last visit gleamed softly out of the half-darkness. In the fender was the battered tin oil stove, a saucepan and 2 cups, provided by Mr. Charrington. Winston lit the burner and set a pan of water to boil. He brought an envelope full of victory coffee and some saccharin tablets. The clock's hand said 20. It was 1920, really. She was coming at 1930. Folly, folly, his heart kept saying. Conscious, gratuitous, suicidal folly. Of all the crimes that a party member could commit, this one was the least possible to conceal. Actually, the idea had first floated into his head in the form of a vision of a glass paperweight mirrored by the surface of the gate table. As he had foreseen, Mr. Charrington had made no difficulty about living the room. He obviously was glad of the few dollars that it would bring him, nor did he seem shocked or become offensively knowing when it was made clear that Winston wanted the room for the purpose of a love affair. Instead, he looked into the middle distance and spoke in generalities with so delicate an air as to give the impression that he had become partly invisible. Privacy, he said, was a very valuable thing. Everyone wanted a place where they could be alone occasionally. And when they had such a place, it was only common courtesy in anyone else who knew of it to keep his knowledge to himself. He, even seeming almost to fade out of existence as he did so, added that there were 2 entries to the house. One of them led through the backyard, which gave them an alley. Under the window somebody was singing. Winston peeped out, secure in the protection of the muslin curtain. The June sun was still high in the sky, and the sun-filled court below a monstrous woman, solid as a Norman pillar, with a brawny red forearms and a sacking apron strapped upon her middle, was stumping about to and fro between a washtub and a clothesline, praying out a series of square white things Winston recognized as babies' diapers. Whenever her mouth was not corked with clothes pegs, she was singing a powerful concerto.
It was only an over's fancy, if I shop and eat Brewdog, with your crown words and dreams I stood, I story of my heart so wide.
The tune had been haunting London for weeks past. It was one of those countless similar songs published for the benefit of the proles by a subsection of the music department. The words of these songs were composed without any human intervention whatever on an instrument known as a versificator. But the women sang so tunefully as to turn the dreadful rubbish into an almost pleasant sound. He could hear the woman singing and scrape her gloves, uh, and scrape her shoes on her flagstones, and the cries of the children on the street. Somewhere in the far distance a faint roar of traffic, and yet the room seemed curiously silent thanks to an absence of a telescreen. Folly, 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 he thought again. It was inconceivable that they could frequent this place for more than a few weeks without being caught, but the temptation of having a hiding place that was truly their own, indoors and near at hand, had been too much for both of them. For some time after their visit to the church belfry it had been impossible to arrange meetings. Working hours had been drastically increased in anticipation of Hate Week. It was more than a month distant, but the enormous complex preparations that it entailed were throwing extra work onto everybody. Finally both of them managed to secure a free afternoon on the same day. They had agreed to go back to the clearing in the wood. On the evening beforehand they met briefly in the street. As usual, Winston hardly looked at Julia as they drifted toward one another in the crowd, but from the short glance he gave her it seemed to him she was paler than usual. "It's all off," she murmured as soon as he judged it safe to speak. "Tomorrow, I mean." "What?" "Tomorrow afternoon I can't come." "Why not?" "There's the usual reason. It started early this time." For a moment he was violently angry. During that month that he had known her nature for his desire for her had changed. At the beginning there had been little true sensuality in it. Their first love-making had simply been an act of the will. But after their second time it was different. The smell of her hair, the taste of her mouth, the feeling of her skin seemed to have gotten inside him, or into the air all around him. She had become a physical necessity, something that he not only wanted, but felt that he had a right to. When she said that she could not come, he had a feeling that she was cheating him. But just at this moment the crowd pressed them together and their hands accidentally met. She gave the tips of his fingers a quick squeeze that seemed to invite not desire but affection. It struck him that when one lived with a woman this particular disappointment must be a normal, recurring event, and a deep tenderness, such as he had not felt for her before, suddenly took hold of him. He wished that they were married a couple of 10 years standing. He wished that they were walking through the streets with her just as they were doing now, but openly and without fear, taking trivialities and buying odds and ends for the household. He wished above all that he had some place where they could be alone together without feeling the obligation to make love every time they met. It's not actually at that moment, but at some time the following day that idea of renting Mr. Charrington's room had occurred to him. When he suggested it to Julia, she had agreed with unexpected readiness. Both of them knew that it was a luxury. It was as though they were intentionally stepping nearer to their graves. He sat waiting on the edge of the bed. He thought again of the cellars of the Ministry of Love. It's curious how that predestined horror moved in and out of one's consciousness. There it lay, fixed in time, preceding death as surely as 99 precedes 100. One could not avoid it, but one could perhaps postpone it. And yet instead, every now and again, by conscious, willful act, one chose to shorten the interval before it happened. At this moment there was a quick step on the stairs. Julia burst into the room. She was carrying a tool bag of coarse brown canvas, such as he had sometimes seen her carrying to and fro at the ministry. He started forward to take her in his arms, but she disengaged herself rather hurriedly, partly because she was still holding the tool bag. "Half a second," she said. "Just let me show you what I've brought. Did you bring some of that filthy Victory coffee? I thought you would." You would chuck it away again because we shan't be needing it. Look here." She fell on her knees and threw open the bag and tumbled out some spanners and a screwdriver that would fill the top part of it. Underneath was a number of neat paper packets. The first packet that she passed to Winston had a strange yet vaguely familiar feeling. It was filled with some kind of heavy sand-like stuff which yielded wherever you touched it. "Isn't it sugar?" he said. "Real sugar, not saccharine sugar. And here's a loaf of bread, proper white bread, not our bloody stuff, and a little pot of jam. And here's a tin of milk, but look, this is the one I'm really proud of. I had to wrap a bit of sacking around it because—" But she didn't really need to tell him why she had wrapped it up. The smell was already filling the room, a rich, hot smell which seemed like an emanation from his early childhood, but which one did occasionally meet even now, blowing down a passageway before a door slammed, or diffusing itself mysteriously in a crowded street. Sniffed for an instant, then lost again. "It's coffee," he murmured. "Real coffee." "It's in a party coffee. They've got a whole kilo here," she said. "How did you manage to get a hold of all these things?" "It's all in the party stuff. There's nothing those swine don't have, nothing. But of course there are waiters and servants and people pinch things, and look, I've got a little packet of tea as well." Winston had squatted down beside her. He tore open a corner of the packet. "It's real tea, not blackberry leaves. There's been a lot of tea about lately. They've captured India or something," she said vaguely. "But listen, dear, I want you to turn your back on me for 3 minutes. Go and sit on the other side of the bed. Don't go too near the window, and don't turn round till I tell you." Winston gazed abstractedly through the muslin curtain. Down in the yard the red-armed woman was still marching to and fro between the wash-tub and the line. She took 2 more pegs out of her mouth, and sang with deep feeling. "They say that your meals all things. They say you can always forget. But smiles and tears across the years, they twist me strings yet." She knew the whole drivelling song by heart, it seemed. Her voice floated upward with the sweet summer air, very tuneful, charged with a sort of happy melancholy. One had the feeling that she would have been perfectly content if the June evening had been endless, and the supply of clothes inexhaustible, to remain there for 1,000 years, paying out diapers and singing rubbish. It struck him as a curious fact that he had ever heard a party member singing alone and spontaneously. It would even have seemed slightly unorthodox, a dangerous eccentricity like talking to oneself. Perhaps it was only when people were somewhere near the starvation level that they had anything to sing about. "You can't turn round just now," said Julia. He turned around for a second and almost failed to recognize her. What he accidentally expected was to see her naked, but she was not naked. The transformation that had happened was much more surprising than that. She had painted her face. She must have slipped into some shop in the proletarian quarters and bought herself a complete set of makeup materials. Her lips were deeply reddened, her cheeks rouged, her nose powdered. There was even a touch of something under her eyes that made them brighter. It's not very skilfully done, but Winston's standards in such matters were not high. He had never before seen or imagined a woman of the party with cosmetics on her face. The improvement in her appearance was startling. With just a few dabs of color in the right places, she had become not only much prettier, but above all, far more feminine. Her short hair and boyish overalls merely added to the effect. As he took her in his arms and a wave of synthetic violets flooded his nostrils, he remembered the half-darkness of a basement kitchen and a woman's cavernous mouth. It was the very same scent that she had used, but at that moment it did not seem to matter. "Scent too?" he said. "Yes, dear, scent too. Do you know what I'm going to do next? I'm going to get hold of a real woman's frock from somewhere, and wear it instead of these bloody trousers. I will stick silk stockings and high-heeled shoes. In this room I'm going to be a woman, not a party comrade." They flung their clothes off and climbed into the huge mahogany bed. It was the first time he had stripped himself naked in her presence. Until now he had been too much ashamed of his pale and meagre body, with varicose veins standing out on his calves and the discolored patch over his ankle. There were no sheets, but a blanket they lay on was threadbare and smooth, and the size and springiness of the bed astonished both of them.
It's sure to be full of bugs, but who cares?
Said Julia. One never saw a double bed nowadays except in the homes of the proles. Winston had occasionally slept in one in his boyhood. Julia had never been in one before, so far as she could remember. Presently they fell asleep for a little while. Then Winston woke up. The hands of the clock had crept round to nearly 9. He did not stir because Julia was sleeping with her head in the crook of his arm. Most of her makeup had transferred itself to his own face in the bolster, where the light stain of rouge still brought out the beauty of her cheekbones. A yellow ray from the sinking sun fell across the foot of the bed and lighted up the fireplace, where the water in the pan was boiling fast. Down in the yard the women had stopped singing, but the faint shouts of children floated in from the street. He wondered vaguely whether it had abolished past. It had been a normal experience to lie in bed like this in the cool of a summer evening, a man and a woman with no clothes on, making love when they choose, talking of what they choose, not feeling any compulsion to get up, simply lying there and listening to peaceful sounds outside. Surely there could never have been a time when that seemed ordinary. Julia woke up, rubbed her eyes, and raised herself on her elbow to look at the oil stove.
That water's half boiled away, she said. I'll get up and make some coffee in another moment. We've got an hour. What time do they cut off the lights in your flats?
23:30.
It's 23 at the hostel, but you have to get in earlier than that because... Hi, get out, you filthy brute.
She suddenly twisted herself over the bed, seized a shoe from the floor, and sent it hurtling into the corner with a boyish jerk of her arm, exactly as he had seen her flick the dictionary at Goldstein that morning during the 2 minutes hate. What was it? He said in surprise.
A rat. I saw him stick his beastly nose out of the waistcoat thing. There's a hole down there. I gave him a good fright anyways.
Rats, Winston murmured. In this room.
They're all over the place, said Julia indifferently as she lay down again. We've even got them in the kitchen at the hostel. Some parts of London are swarming with them. Do you know they attack children? Yes, they do. In some of these streets a woman daren't leave a baby alone for 2 minutes. It's great huge brown ones that do it. And the nasty thing is that the brutes always...
Don't go on, said Winston, with his eyes shut tight.
Dearest, you've gone quite pale. What's the matter? Do they make you feel sick?
Of all the horrors in the world, a rat. She pressed herself against him and wound her lips around him, and though to reassure him with the warmth of her body. He did not immediately reopen his eyes. For several moments he had the feeling of being back in a nightmare, which had recurred from time to time throughout his life. It was always very much the same. He was standing in front of a wall of darkness, and on the other side of it there was something unendurable, something too dreadful to be faced. In the dream his deepest feeling was always one of self-deception, because he did in fact know what was behind the wall of darkness. With a deadly effort, like wrenching a piece out of his own brain, he could have dragged the thing out into the open. He always woke up without discovering what it was. Somehow it was connected with what Julia had been saying when he cut her short. "I'm sorry," he said. "It's nothing. I don't like rats, that's all."
Oh, don't worry, dear. We're not going to have the filthy brutes in here. I'll stuff the hole with a bit of sacking before we go. The next time we come here, I'll bring some plaster and bung it up properly.
Already the black instant of panic was half forgotten. Feeling just slightly ashamed of himself, he sat up against the bedhead. Julia got out of the bed, pulled on her overalls, and made the coffee. The smell that rose from the saucepan was so powerful and exciting that they shut the windows lest anybody outside should notice it and become inquisitive. What was even better than the taste of the coffee was the silky texture given to it by the sugar, the thing Winston had almost forgotten after years of saccharin. With one hand in her pocket and a piece of bread and jam in the other, Julia wandered about the room, glancing indifferently at the bookcase, pointing out the best way of repairing the gate-like table, pumping herself down the ragged armchair to see if it was comfortable, and examining the absurd 12-hour clock with a sort of tolerant amusement. She brought the glass paperweight over to the bed to have a look at it in a better light. He took it out of her hand, fascinated as always by the soft, rain-watery appearance of the glass. "What is it, do you think?" said Julia. "I don't think it's anything. I don't think it was ever put to any use. That's what I like about it. It's a little chunk of history that they've forgotten to alter. It's a message from 100 years ago, if one knew how to read it." "And that picture over there?" She nodded at the engraving on the opposite wall. "Would that be 100 years old?" "More, 200, I dare say. One can't tell. It's impossible to discover the age of anything nowadays." She went over to look at it. "Here's where the brute struck his nose out," she said, kicking the wainscoting and immediately below the picture. "What is this place? I've seen it before somewhere." "It's a church, or at least it used to be. St. Clement's Dane the name was." The fragment of the rhyme Mr. Charrington had taught him came back into his head, and he added half nostalgically, "Oranges and lemons, say the bells of St. Clement's." To his astonishment she clapped at the line, "You owe me 3 farthings, say the bells of St. Martin's. When will you pay me, say the bells of Old Bailey." I can't remember how it goes after that, but anyway I remember it ends up, "Here comes a candle to light you to bed." "And here comes a chopper to chop off your head." It's like two halves of a countersign, but there must be another line after the bells of Old Bailey. Perhaps it could be dug out of Mr. Charrington's memory if he were suitably prompted. "Who taught you that?" he said. "My grandfather. He used to say to me, when he was a little girl, I was vaporized. He was vaporized when I was 8. At any rate, he disappeared. Wonder what a lemon was," she added inconsequentially. "I've seen oranges. They've got kind of a yellow fruit with a thick skin." "I can't remember lemons," said Winston. "They were quite common in the 50s. They were so sour that it would set your teeth on edge to even smell them." "I bet that picture's got bugs behind it," said Julia. "I'll take it down and give it a good cleaning some day. I suppose it's almost time we were leaving. I must start washing this paint off. What a bore. I'll get the lipstick from your face afterwards." Winston didn't get up for a few minutes more. The room was darkening. He turned over toward the light and lay gazing into the glass paperweight. The inexhaustibly interesting thing was not a fragment of coral, but the interior of the glass itself. There was such a depth to it, and yet almost transparent as air. It was as though the surface of the glass had been the arc of the sky, enclosed in a tiny world with its atmosphere complete. He had the feeling that he could get inside it. In that fact, he was inside it, along with the mahogany bed and the Gatling table and the clock and steel engraving and paperweight itself. The paperweight was the room he was in, and the coral was Julia's life and his own, fixed in a sort of eternity at the heart of the crystal. Ooh. Yes, just all kinds of love. All is love, but we on chapter 5 now, part 2. Yes, someone just pointed out to me that in continental Spain they actually use a H instead of an X in Texas, which is pretty dope. Thank you to Huge Butt on the r/alternate history of Discord. It's a very dope Discord. But for the record, I was born in 1990. So I was not born in 1984. Oh my goodness. But all kinds of love going out to Don't Watch Continue. Dog Rose against the world. Gee. He gets mad at me when I overhype his name. Yes. But that is where we are at. Gas the fuck out of it. Oh man, but also a huge shout out to the Nostalgic Library, without whom I would not be able to continue doing these ratings every day that I've been able to do. It's not really every day, y'all know that much, but I'll be coming in here a couple times a week, and that's great. That's all I need. It's excellent. Remember to smash that like button. Smash the like. Sim had vanished. The morning came and he was missing from work. A few thoughtless people commented on his absence. On the next day, nobody mentioned him. On the third day, Winston went into the vestibule of the records department to look at the notice board. One of the notices carried a printed list of members of the chess committee, whom Sim had been one. It looked almost exactly as it had before, and nothing had even been crossed out, but it was one name shorter. It was enough. Sim had ceased to exist. He had never existed. The weather was baking hot. In the labyrinth ministry, the windowless, air-conditioned room kept their temperature. But outside, the pavement scorched one's feet, and the stench of the tubes at the rush hours was a horror. The preparations for Hate Week were in full swing, and the staffs of all the ministries were working overtime. Processions, meetings, military parades, lectures, waxwork displays, film shows, telescreen programs all had to be organized. Stands had to be erected, effigies built, slogans coined, songs written, rumors circulated, photographs faked. Julia's unit in the fiction department had been taken off production of novels and was rushing out a series of atrocity pamphlets. Winston, in addition to his regular work, had spent long periods of every day going back through files of the Times, altering and embellishing the news itself, which were to be quoted in speeches. Late at night, when crowds of rowdy Poles roamed the streets, the town had curiously fertile air. The rocket bombs crashed oftener than ever, and sometimes in the far distance there was an enormous explosion which no one could explain, about which there were wild rumors. The new tune, which was to be the theme song of Hate Week, the Hate Song it was called, was already being composed and being endlessly plugged on the telescreens. It had a savage, barking rhythm which could not exactly be called music, but rather resembled the beating of a drum, roared out by hundreds of voices to the tramp of marching feet. It was terrifying. The pearls had taken a fancy to it, and in the midnight streets competed with the still popular "It Was Only a Hopeless Fancy." The parson's children played it in all hours, night and day, unbearably, on a comb and a piece of toilet paper. Winston's evenings were fuller than ever. Squads of volunteers organized by parsons were preparing the street for Hate Week, stitching banners, painting posters, erecting flagstaffs on the roof, and perilously slinging wires across the street of the reception streamers. Parsons boasted that Victory Mansions alone would display 400 meters of bunting. He was in his native element and happy as a lark. The heat and manual work had given him the pretext for reverting to shorts and an open shirt in the evenings. He was everywhere at once, pushing and pulling, sawing, hammering, improvising, jollying everybody, along with comradely expressions, and giving out every folded from his body what seemed an inexhaustible supply of acrid, smelling sweat. A new poster had suddenly appeared all over London. It had no caption and simply represented the monstrous figure of a Eurasian soldier, 3 or 4 meters high, striding forward with expressionless Mongolian face and enormous boots, the submachine gun pointed from his hip. From whatever angle you looked at the poster, the muzzle of the gun, magnified by foreshortening, seemed to be pointed straight at you. The thing had been plastered on every blank space, on every wall, even outnumbering the portraits of Big Brother. The proles, normally apathetic about the war, were being lashed into one of their periodical frenzies of patriotism, as though to harmonize with the general mood. The rocket bombs had been killing larger numbers of people than usual. One fell on a crowded film theater in Septeni. I've never seen nor heard of Septeni, but in Septeni, burying several hundred victims among the ruins. The whole population of the neighborhood turned out for a long, trailing funeral, which went on for hours and was in effect an indignation meeting. Another bomb fell on a piece of waste ground which was used as a playground, and several dozen children were blown to pieces. There were further angry demonstrations. Goldstein was burned in effigy. Hundreds of copies of the poster of the Eurasian soldier were torn down and added to the flames, and a number of shops were looted in the turmoil. Then rumor flew round that spies were directing the rocket bombs by means of wireless waves, and an old couple who were suspected of being foreign extraction had their house set on fire and perished of suffocation. In the room over Mr. Charrington's shop, where they could get there, Julia and Winston laid side by side on the strip bed under the open window, naked for the sake of coolness. The rat had never come back, but the bugs had multiplied hideously in the heat. It did not seem to matter, dirty or clean, the room was paradise. As soon as they arrived, they would sprinkle everything with pepper brought on the black market, tear off their clothes, and make love with the sweating bodies, then fall asleep and wake to find that the bugs had rallied and were massing for the counterattack. 4, 5, 6, 7 times they met during the month of June. Winston had dropped his habit of drinking gin at all hours. He seemed to have lost the need for it. He had grown fatter. His varicose ulcer had subsided, leaving only a brown stain on the skin above his ankle. His fits of coughing in the early morning had stopped. The process of life had ceased to be intolerable. He had no longer any impulse to make faces at the telescreen or shout curses at the top of his voice. Now they had a secure hiding place, almost a home. It didn't even seem like a hardship that they could meet only infrequently and for a couple hours at a time. What mattered was that the room was over the junk shop, existing. To know that it was there, even late, was almost the same as being in it. The room was a world, a pocket where the past, where extinct animals could walk. Mr. Charrington thought Winston was another extinct animal. He usually stopped to talk with Mr. Charrington for a few minutes on his way upstairs. The old man seemed seldom or never to go out of the doors, and on the other hand to have almost no customers. He led a ghost-like existence between tiny, dirty, sharp shop and an even tinier back kitchen where he prepared his meals, and which contained, among other things, an unbelievably ancient gramophone with an enormous horn. He seemed glad of the opportunity to talk, wandering about his worthless stock with his long nose and thick spectacles and bowed shoulders in his velvet jacket. He had always vaguely the air of being a collector rather than a tradesman. With a sort of faded enthusiasm, he would finger this scrap of rubbish or that, the china bottle stopper, the painted lid of a broken snuff-box, pinch-backed locket containing a strand of some long-dead baby's hair, never asking that Winston should buy it, but merely that he should admire it. To talk to him was like listening to the tinkling of a worn-out musical box. He dragged out from the corners of his memory some more fragments of forgotten rhymes. There was one about 4 and 20 blackbirds, another about a cow with a crumpled horn, another about the death of poor Cock Robin. It just occurred to me that you might be interested. he would say with a depreciating little laugh whenever he produced a new fragment. We can never recall more than a few lines of any one rhyme. Both of them knew, in a way, it was never out of their minds, that what was now happening could not last long. There were times when the fact of impending death seemed as palpable as the bed they lay on, and they would cling together with a sort of despairing sensuality, like a damned soul grasping at the last morsel of pleasure on the clock within 5 minutes of striking. But there were also timers when they had the illusion of not only safety but of permanence. So long as they were actually in this room, they both felt no harm could come to them. Getting there was difficult and dangerous, but the room itself was a sanctuary. It was as when Winston had gazed into the heart of the paperweight, when the feeling it would be possible to get inside the glassy world, and that once inside it would could that and that once inside it time could be arrested. Often they gave themselves up to the daydreams of escape. Their luck would hold indefinitely, and they would carry on their intrigue just like this for the remainder of their natural lives, where Catherine would die and by subtle maneuvers Winston and Julia would succeed in getting married, or they would commit suicide together, or they would despair, alter themselves out of recognition, learn to speak with proletarian accents, get jobs in a factory, and live out their lives undetected in a back street. It was all nonsense, as they both knew. In reality, there was no escape. Even the one plan that was practicable suicide, they had no intention of carrying out. To hang on from day to day and from week to week, spinning out at a present that had no future, seemed an unconquerable instinct, just as one's lungs always draw their next breath so long as the air is available. Sometimes, too, they talked of engaging in active rebellion against the party, but they had no notion of how to take the first step. Even if a fabulous brotherhood was a reality, there still remained the difficulty of finding one's way into it. He told her of strange intimacy that existed or seemed to exist between himself and O'Brien, and of the impulse he sometimes felt simply to walk into O'Brien's presence, announce that he was the enemy of the party, and demand his help. Curiously enough, this did not strike her as an impossibly rash thing to do. She was used to judging people by their faces, and it seemed natural to her that Winston should believe O'Brien to be more trustworthy on the strength of a single flash of his eyes. Moreover, she took it for granted that everyone, or nearly everyone, secretly hated the party and would break the rules if he thought it was safe to do so. But she refused to believe that widespread organized opposition existed or could exist. Tales about Goldstein and his underground army, she said, were simply a lot of rubbish which the party had invented for its own purposes and which had pretended to believe it. Times before number, at party rallies and spontaneous demonstrations, she had shouted at the top of her voice for the execution of people whose names she had never heard, and in whose suspicious crimes she had not the faintest belief. When public trials were happening, she had taken her place in the detachments from the Youth League, who were surrounded in the courts from morning to night, chanting at intervals, "Death to traitors!" During the 2 minutes 8, she always excelled all others in shouting insults at Goldstein. She had only the dimmest idea of who Goldstein was and what doctrines he was supposed to represent. She had grown up since the Revolution and was too young to remember the ideological battles of the 50s and 60s. Such a thing as an independent political movement was outside her imagination, and in any case, the party was invincible. It would always exist, and it would always be the same. You could only rebel against it by secret disobedience, or, at most, by isolated acts of violence, such as killing somebody or blowing something up. In some ways she was far more accurate than Winston, and far less susceptible to party propaganda. Once he happened in some connection to mention the war in Eurasia. She startled him by casually saying that her opinion that the war was not happening. The rocket bombs which fell daily on London were probably fired from the government of Oceania itself, just to keep people frightened. This was an idea that had literally never occurred to him. She also stirred in envy by him telling him that during the 2 minutes 8 her great difficulty was to avoid bursting out laughing. But she only questioned the teachings of the party when they in some way touched upon her own life. Often she was ready to accept the official mythology simply because the difference between truth and falsehood did not seem important to her. She believed, for instance, having learnt it at school, that the party had invented airplanes. In his own school days, Winston remembered in the late 50s it was only the helicopter that the party had claimed to invent. A dozen years later, when Julia was at school, they were already claiming the airplane. One generation more, it would be claiming the steam engine. When we told her that airplanes had been in existence since before he was born and long before the revolution, the fact struck her as totally uninteresting. After all, what did it matter who had invented airplanes? It was rather more of a shock to him when he discovered from some chance remark that she did not remember that Oceania, 40 years ago, had been at war with East Asia and at peace with Eurasia. It was true that she regarded the whole war as a sham, but apparently she had not even noticed that the name of the enemy had changed. "I just thought we have always been at war with Eurasia," she said vaguely. It frightened him a little. The invention of airplanes dated from long before her birth, but the switchover in war only happened 40 years ago, well after she was grown up. He argued with her about it for perhaps a quarter of an hour. In the end he succeeded in forcing her memory back until she did dimly recall that one time East Asia, not Eurasia, had been the enemy. But the issue still struck her as unimportant. "Who cares?" she said impatiently. "It was always one bloody war after another, and one knows that news is all lies anyways." Sometimes he talked to her of the records department and impudent forgeries he committed there. Such things did not appear to horrify her. She did not feel the abyss opening beneath her feet at the thought of the lies becoming truths. He told her the story of Jones, Aronson, Rutherford, the momentous slip of paper which he had once held between his fingers, and did not make much impression on her. At first, indeed, she failed to grasp the point of the story. "Were they friends of yours?" she said. "No, I never knew them. They were inner party members. Besides, they were far older men than I was. They belonged to the old days before the Revolution. I barely knew them by sight." "Then what was there to worry about? People are being killed off all the time, aren't they?" He tried to make her understand. This was an exceptional case. It wasn't just a question of somebody being killed. You realize that the past, starting from yesterday, has actually been abolished. If it survives anywhere, it's in a few sorted objects with no words attached to them, like that lump of glass there. Already we know almost nothing about the Revolution in the years before the Revolution. Every record has been destroyed or falsified. Every book has been rewritten. Every picture has been repainted. Every statue and street and building has been renamed. Every date has been altered. In that process, continuing day by day, minute by minute, history has stopped. Nothing exists except an endless present in which the party is always right. I know, of course, that the past is falsified, but it would never have been possible for me to prove it even when I did the falsification myself. After the thing is done, no evidence ever remains. The only evidence is inside my own mind, and I don't know with any certainty that any other human being shares my memories. Just in that one instance in my whole life, I did possess actual concrete evidence after the event, years after it. And what good was that? It was no good because I threw it away minutes later. But the same thing happened today. I should keep it. "Well, I wouldn't," said Julia. "I'm quite ready to take risks, but only for something worthwhile and not for bits of old newspaper which you could have done without it, ever, if you had kept it." "Well, not much perhaps, but it was evidence. I might have planted a few doubts here and there, supposing that I had dared to show it to anybody. I don't imagine that we can alter anything in our own lifetime, but I can imagine little knots of resistance springing up here and there, small groups of people banding themselves together and gradually moving, growing, and even leaving a few records behind so that the next generation can carry on where we leave off. I'm not interested in the next generation, dear. I'm interested in us." "You're only a rebel from the waist downwards," he told her. She thought this brilliantly witty and flung her arms around him in delight. In the ramifications of party doctrine she had not the faintest interest. Whenever he began to talk about the principles of Ingsoc, doublethink, the mutability of the past, and the denial of objective reality, and to use new speak words, she became bored and confused and said that she'd never paid any attention to that kind of thing, only that it was all rubbish. So why let oneself be worried about it? She knew when to cheer and when to boo, and that was all one needed. If he persisted in talking of such subjects, she had a disconcerting habit of falling asleep. She was one of those people who can go to sleep at any hour and in any position. Talking to her, he realized how easy it was to prevent an appearance of orthodoxy while having no grasp on whether orthodoxy meant. In a way, the worldview of the party imposed itself most successfully on people incapable of understanding it. They could be made to accept the most flagrant violations of reality because they never fully grasped the enormity of what was demanded of them and were not sufficiently interested in public events to notice what was happening. By lack of understanding, they remained sane. They simply swallowed everything, and what they swallowed did them no harm because it left no residue behind, just as a grain of corn will pass undigested through the body of a bird. That was chapter 5 of part 2, and we are now on chapter 6 of part 2. And then, yes, that's short. We're gonna be yes, we're gonna be reading for a little bit longer for sure. Once again, I guess I need to do all my shout outs because I got so much love out here. Anderson Township Library, Against the World, G. George Orwell, Dog Rules, Don't Watch Continue. All the fine folks over at the r/alternate history hub. But yes, I just had the epiphany that if you were born in 1984, you are now the same age as Winston of 1984. This year, yes. So kind of drink that in because this book is really important. And people need to understand the importance of literature in this world. Can't underestimate it. Man. Yes, shouts out to 100% right 50% of the time for pointing out that if you were born in 1984, you would be 37. Because I hadn't even thought about that, but it feels like it's important. Chapter 6. It happened at last. The expecting message had come. All his life, he seemed to him, he had been waiting for this to happen. He was walking down the long corridor at the ministry, and he was almost at the spot where Julia had slipped the note into his hand when he became aware that someone larger than himself was walking just behind him. The person, whoever it was, gave a small cough, evidently as a prelude to speaking. Winston stopped abruptly and turned. It was O'Brien. At last they were face to face, and it seemed that his only impulse was to run away. His heart bounded violently. He would have been incapable of speaking. O'Brien, however, had continued forward in the same moment, lying a friendly hand on Winston's arm, so that the two of them were walking side by side. And he began speaking with that particular grave courtesy that differentiated him from the majority of inner party members.
I had been hoping for the opportunity to talk to you, he said. I was reading one of your Newspeak articles in the Times the other day. You take a scholarly interest in Newspeak, I believe.
Winston had recovered part of his self-possession. "Hardly scholarly," he said. "I'm only an amateur. It's not my subject. I have never anything to do with the actual conversation of the language."
But you write in it very elegantly, said O'Brien. This is not only my own opinion. I was talking recently to a friend of yours who is certainly an expert. His name has slipped my memory for a moment.
Again Winston's heart seared painfully. It was inconceivable that this was anything other than a reference to Sim, but Sim was not only dead, he was abolished and unpersoned. Any identifiable reference to him would have been morally dangerous. O'Brien's remark must have been intended as a signal, a code word. By sharing a small act of thought crime, he had turned the two of them into accomplices. They continued to stroll slowly down the corridor, but now O'Brien halted. With curious, disarming friendliness he always managed to put into the gesture, he resettled his spectacles on his nose. Then he went on.
What I really intended to say was that in your article I noticed you had used two words which have become obsolete. But they've only become so very recently. Have you seen the 10th edition of the Newspeak Dictionary?
"No," said Winston. "I don't think it had been issued yet. We are still using the ninth in the records department."
The 10th edition is not due to appear for some months, I believe, but a few advance copies have been circulated. I have one myself. It might interest you to look at it, perhaps.
"Very much so," said Winston, immediately seeing where this tended.
Some of the new developments are most ingenious. The reduction in the number of verbs. That is the point. That will appeal to you, I think. Let me see. I shall send a messenger to you with the dictionary, but I am invariably afraid to forget anything of that kind. Perhaps you could pick it up at my flat at some time that suited you. Wait, let me give you my address.
They were standing in front of a telescreen. Somewhat absent-mindedly, O'Brien felt two of his pockets, and then produced a small leather-covered notebook and a gold ink pencil. Immediately beneath the telescreen, in such a position that anyone who was watching at the other end of the instrument could read what he was writing, he scribbled an address, tore out a page, and handed it to Winston.
I'm usually at home in the evenings, he said. If not, my servant will give you the dictionary.
He was gone, leaving Winston holding a scrap of paper which this time there was no need to conceal. Nevertheless, he carefully memorized what was written on it, and some hours later dropped it into the memory hole, along with a mass of other papers. They had been talking to one another for a couple of minutes at most. There was only one meaning that the episode could possibly have. It had been contrived as a way of letting Winston know O'Brien's address. This was necessary because, except by direct inquiry, it was never possible to discover where anyone lived. There were no directories of any kind. "If you want to see me, this is where I can be found," was what O'Brien had been saying to him. Perhaps there would even be a message concealed somewhere in the dictionary. But at any rate, one thing was certain. The conspiracy that he dreamed of did exist, and he had reached the outer edges of it. He knew that sooner or later he would obey Brian's summons. Perhaps tomorrow, perhaps after a long delay, he was not certain. What was happening was only the working out of the process that had started years ago. The first step had been a secret, involuntary thought. The second had been the opening of the diary. He moved from thoughts to words, and now from words to actions. The last step was something that would have happened in the ministry of love. He had accepted it. The end was contained in the beginning. But it was frightening, or more exactly, it was like a foretaste of death, like being a little bit less alive. Even while he was speaking to O'Brien, when the meaning of the words had sunk in, a chilly, shuddering feeling had taken possession of his body. He had the sensation of stepping into the dampness of a grave, and it was not much better, because he had always known that the grave was there waiting for him. Ooh, about an hour into it. 7 chapters into the second part. Feeling good. Hope y'all are doing good too. Shouts out. Don't watch continue. Shouts out against the World Z. Shouts out to the r/alternate history of Discord. Rakeem, Brittany, Marie. Shouts out to the Anderson Township Library with their awesome staff. Yes. Oh man. Let me just get 1 second. Chapter 7 though. Yes. Wednesday had woken up with his eyes full of tears. Julia rolled sleepily against him, murmuring something that might have been. What's the matter? I dreamt, he began and stopped short. It was too complex to put into words. There was a dream itself, and there was a memory connected with it that swam into his mind a few seconds after waking. He lay back with his eyes shut, still sodden in the atmosphere of the dream. It was a vast, luminous dream in which his whole life seemed to stretch out before him, like a landscape on a summer evening after rain. It had all occurred inside the glass paperweight, but the surface of the glass was the dome of the sky, and inside the dome everything was flooded with clear, soft light, in which one could see the interminable distances. The dream had also been comprehended by, indeed, in some sense it had consisted in a gesture of the arm made by his mother and made again 30 years later by the Jewish woman he had seen on the news film, trying to shelter the small boy from the bullets before the helicopters blew them both to pieces. You know, he said, until this moment I believed I had murdered my mother. Why did you murder her? Said Julia, almost asleep. I didn't murder her, not physically. In the dream he remembered his last glimpse of his mother. Within a few moments of waking, the cluster of small events surrounding it had all come back. His memory they must have deliberately pushed out of his consciousness over many years. He's not certain of the date, but he could not have been less than 10 years old, possibly 12 when it happened. His father had disappeared some time earlier. How much earlier he could not remember. He remembered better the racketry, uneasy circumstances of the time, the periodical panics about air raids and the sheltering in tube stations, the piles of rubble everywhere, the unintelligible proclamations posted at street corners and gangs of youths in shirts all the same color, the enormous queues outside the bakeries, the intermittent machine gun fire in the distance, above all the fact that there was never enough to eat. He remembered long afternoons spent with other boys and scrounging round dustbins and rubbish heaps, picking out the ribs of cabbage leaves, potato peelings, and sometimes even scraps of stale bread crust from which they had carefully scraped away the cinders, and also in waiting for the passing of trucks which traveled over a certain route and were known to carry cattle feed, and which, when they jolted over the bad patches in the road, sometimes split into a few fragments of oil cake. When his father disappeared, his mother did not show any surprise or violent grief, but a sudden change came over her. She seemed to have become completely spiritless. It was evident even to Winston that she was waiting for something that she knew must happen. She had everything that was needed: cooked, washed, mended, made the bed, swept the floor, dusted the mantelpiece. always very slowly and with a curious lack of superfluous motion like an artist's lay figure moving its own accord. Her large, shapely body seemed to relapse naturally into stillness. For hours at a time she would sit almost immobile on the bed, nursing his young sister, a tiny, ailing, very silent child of 2 or 3, with a face made simian by thinness. Very occasionally she would take Winston in her arms and press him against her for a long time without saying anything. He was aware, in spite of his youthfulness and selfishness, that this was somehow connected with the never-mentioned thing that was about to happen. He remembered the room where they lived, a dark, close-smelling room that seemed half filled by a bed with a white counterpane. There was a gas ring in the fender and a shelf where food was kept, and on the landing outside there was a brown earthenware sink, common to several rooms. He remembered his mother's statuesque body bending over the gas ring to stir at something in the saucepan. Above all, he remembered his continuous hunger and fierce sordid battles at meal times. He would ask his mother naggingly over and over again why was there not more food. He would shout and storm at her. He even remembered the tones of his voice, which was beginning to look prematurely and sometimes boomed in a particular way, or he would attempt a snivelling note of pathos with the efforts to get more than his share. His mother was quite ready to give him more than his share. She took for granted that he, the boy, should have the biggest portion, but however much she gave him, he invariably demanded more. At every meal she would beseech him not to be selfish and remember that his little sister was sick and also needed food, but it was of no use. He would cry out with rage when she stopped ladling, and he would try to wrench the saucepan spoon out of her hands. He would grab bits from his sister's plate. He knew that he was starving the other two, but he couldn't help it. He even felt that he had a right to do it. The clamorous hunger in his belly seemed to justify him. Between meals, if his mother did not stand guard, he was constantly pilfering at the wretched store of food on the shelf. One day a chocolate ration was issued. There had been no such issue for weeks or months past. He remembered quite clearly that precious little morsel of chocolate. It was a 2-ounce slab. They still talked about ounces in those days. Between the 3 of them, it was obvious that it ought to be divided into 3 equal parts. Suddenly, as though he were listening to somebody else, Winston heard himself demanding in a loud, booming voice that he should be given the whole piece. His mother told him not to be greedy. There was a loud, nagging argument that went round and round with shouts, whines, tears, remonstrances, bargainings. His tiny sister clung to her mother with both hands exactly like a baby monkey, sat looking over her shoulder at him with large, mournful eyes. In the end his mother broke off 3/4 of the chocolate and gave it to Winston, giving the other quarter to his sister. The little girl took hold of it and looked at it dully, perhaps not knowing what it was. Winston stood watching her for a moment, then with a sudden, swift spring he snatched the piece of chocolate out of his sister's hand and was fleeing for the door.
Winston, Winston, his mother called after him. Come back, give your sister her chocolates.
He stopped, but he did not come back. His mother's anxious eyes were fixed on his face. Even now she was thinking about that thing. He did not know what it was that was on the point of happening. His sister, conscious of having been robbed of something, had set up a feeble wail. His mother drew her arm around the child and pressed its face against her breast. Something in the gesture told him that his sister was dying. He turned and fled down the stairs with chocolate growing sticky in his hand. He never saw his mother again. After he devoured the chocolate, he felt somewhat ashamed of himself and hung about in the streets for several hours until hunger drove him home. When he came back, his mother had disappeared. This was already become normal at that time. Nothing was gone from the room except for his mother and sister. They had not taken any clothes except for his mother's overcoat. To this day he had not known with any certainty that his mother was dead. It was perfectly possible that she had merely been sent to a forced labor camp. As for his sister, she might have been removed like Winston himself to one of the colonies for homeless children, reclamation centers they were called, which had grown up as a result of the Civil War, or she might have been sent to the labor camp along with his mother, or simply left somewhere or other to die. The dream was still vivid in his mind, especially enveloping, protecting gesture of the arm in which its whole meaning seemed to be contained. His mind went back to another dream of 2 months ago, exactly as his mother had sat in the dingy, white quilted bed with the child clinging to her, so she had in the sunken ship far underneath him, drowning deeper every minute, but still looking up at him through the darkening water. He told Julia the story of his mother's disappearance. Without opening her eyes, she rolled over and settled herself into a more comfortable position. "I expected you were a little beastly swine in those days," she had said indistinctly. "All children are swine." Yes, but the real point of the story, her breathing it, was the evidence that she was going to sleep again. He would have liked to continue talking about his mother. He didn't suppose from what he could remember of her that she had been an unusual woman, still less an intelligent one. And yet she had possessed some kind of nobility, a kind of purity, simply because the standards that she obeyed were private ones. Her feelings were her own, and she could not be altered from the outside. It would not have occurred to her that an action which is ineffectual thereby becomes meaningless. If you loved someone, you loved them, and when you had nothing else to give, you still gave them love. When the last of the chocolate was gone, his mother clasped the child in her arms. It was no use. Nothing changed. It didn't produce more chocolate. It didn't avert the child's death or her own, but it seemed natural to her to do it. The refugee woman in the boat had also covered the little boy in her arm, which was no more use against the bullets than a sheet of paper. The terrible thing that the party had done was to persuade you that mere impulses, mere feelings, were of no account, while at the same time robbing you of all power over the material world. Once you were in the grip of the party, you felt or did not feel what you did or refrained from doing made literally no difference. Whatever happened, you vanished, and neither you nor your actions was ever heard from again. You were lifted clean out of the stream of history, and yet to the people of only 2 generations ago this would not have seemed all that important, because they were not attempting to alter history. They were governed by private loyalties which they did not question. What mattered were individual relationships, and a completely helpless gesture, an embrace, a tear, a word spoken to a dying man could have value in itself. The pearls, it suddenly occurred to him, had remained in this condition. They were not loyal to a party or a country or an idea. They were loyal to one another. For the first time in his life he did not despise the pearls or think of them merely as an inert force which would one day spring to life and regenerate the world. The pearls had stayed human. They had not been hardened inside. They had held on to primitive emotions which he himself had to reclaim by conscious effort. And thinking this, he remembered without apparent reverence how a few weeks ago he had seen a severed hand lying in the pavement, and had kicked it into the gutter as though it had been a cabbage stalk. "The pearls are human beings," he said aloud. "We are not human." "Why not?" Julia, who had woken up again. He thought for a little while. "Has it ever occurred to you," he said, "that it is best for us to do would be to simply walk out of here before it's too late and never see each other again?" "Yes, dear, it has occurred to me several times, but I'm not going to do it all the same. We've been lucky," he said, "but it can't last much longer. You're young. You look normal and innocent. If you keep clear of people like me, you might stay alive for another 50 years. No, I've thought it out. What you do, I'm going to do. And don't be too downhearted. I'm rather good at staying alive. We may be together for another 6 months, a year, there's no knowing, but in the end we're certain to be apart. Do you realize how utterly alone we shall be once they get a hold of us? There will be nothing, literally nothing, that either of us can do for the other. If I confess, they'll shoot you, and if I refuse to confess, they'll shoot you just the same. Nothing I can do or say to stop myself from saying will put off your death for as much as 5 minutes. Neither of us will ever know whether the other is dead or alive. We shall be utterly without power of any kind. And the one thing that matters is that we shouldn't betray one another, even though we can't make the slightest difference. You mean confessing? She said. We shall do that right enough. Everybody always confesses. You can't help that. I don't mean confessing. Confession is not betrayal. What you say or don't doesn't matter. Only feelings matter. They can make me stop loving you. That would be the real betrayal. She thought it over. They can't do that, she said finally. That's the one thing they can't do. They can't make you say anything, but they can't make you believe it. They can't get inside of you. No, he said a little more hopefully. No, that's quite true. They can't get inside of you. If you feel that staying human is worthwhile, even when it can't have any results whatever, you've beaten them. He thought of the telescreen with its never sleeping ear. They could spy on us day and night. But if you ever kept them in your head, you could still outwit them. With all their cleverness, they had never mastered the secret of finding out what another human being was thinking. Perhaps that was less true when you were actually in their hands. One did not know what happened inside the Ministry of Love, but it was possible to guess. Tortures, drugs, delicate instruments that registered your nervous reactions, gradual wearing down by sleeplessness and solitude, persistent questioning. Facts, at any rate, could not be kept hidden. They could be tracked down by inquiry. They could be squeezed out of you by torture. But if the object was not to stay alive, but to stay human, what difference did it ultimately make? They could alter your feelings. For that matter, you could not alter them yourself, even if you wanted to. They could lay bare, in the utmost detail, everything you had done or said or thought, but in your inner heart, whose workings are mysterious even to yourself, remained impregnable. Ah, man, chapter 8. Shouts out Octa Wave. Shouts out Against the World. Shouts out Don't Watch Continue. Shouts out r/alternate history of Discord. Chapter 8. They had done it at last. The room they were standing in was long, shaped, and softly lit. The telescreen was dimmed to a low murmur, and the richness of the dark blue carpet gave the impression of treading on velvet. At the far end of the room, O'Brien was sitting at a table under a green-shaded lamp, with a mass of papers on either side of him. He had not bothered to look up when the servant showed Julia and Winston in. Winston's heart was thumping so hard that he doubted whether he would be able to speak. They had done it. They had done it at last, was all he could think. It had been a rash act to come here at all, and sheer folly to arrive together. Though it was true they had come different routes, only to meet at O'Brien's doorstep, but merely to walk into such a place and get an effort of the nerve. It was only on such rare occasions that one saw the dwellings of an inner party member, or even penetrate into the quarter of the town where they lived. The whole atmosphere of the huge block of flats, the richness, the spaciousness of everything, the familiar smells of good food and good tobacco, the silent and incredibly rapid lifts sliding up and down, the white-jacketed servants hurrying to and fro, everything was intimidating. Although he had a good pretext for coming here, he was haunted at every step by the fear that a black uniformed guard would suddenly appear from round the corner, demand his papers, and order him to get out. O'Brien's servant, however, had admitted the two of them without demur. He was a small, dark-haired man in a white jacket with a diamond-shaped, completely expressionless face which might have been that of a Chinese. The passage on which he led them was softly carpeted, with cream-papered walls and white wainscoting, all exquisitely clean. It was too intimidating. Winston could not even remember ever to have seen a passageway whose walls were not grimy from the contact of human bodies. O'Brien had a slip of paper between his fingers and seemed to be studying it intently. His heavy face bent down so that one could see the line of his nose. Looked both formidable and intelligent. Perhaps 20 seconds he sat without stirring. Then he pulled the speakwrite towards him and rapped out a message in the hybrid jargon of the ministries.
Items 1, 5, 7 approved fool-wise. Stop suggestion. Contained item 6 double plus ridiculous verging crime think cancel, stop, unproceed, construct-wise, anti-getting, plus full estimates, machinery overhead, stop, end message.
He rose deliberately from his chair and came toward them round the soundless carpet. A little of the official atmosphere seemed to have fallen away from him with the newspeak words, but his expression was grimmer than usual, as though he were not pleased at being disturbed. The terror that Winston had already felt was suddenly shot through by the streak of ordinary embarrassment. It seemed to him quite possible that he had simply made a mistake. For what evidence had he in the reality that O'Brien was any kind of political conspirator? Nothing but a flash of his eyes and a single equivocal remark. Beyond that, only his secret imaginings founded a dream. He could not even fall back on the pretense that he had come to borrow the dictionary, because in that case Julia's presence was impossible to explain. As O'Brien passed the telescreen, a thought seemed to strike him. He stopped, turned aside, and pressed the switch on the wall. There was a sharp snap. The voice stopped. Julia uttered a tiny sound, a short squeak of surprise even in the midst of his panic. Winston was too much taken aback to be able to hold his tongue. "You can cut it off," he said.
Yes, said Orion, we can turn it off. We have that privilege.
He was opposite them now. His solid form towered over the pair of them with an expression on his face was still indecipherable. Was he waiting somewhat sternly for Winston to speak? But about what? Even now it was conceivable that he was simply a busy man wondering irritably why he had been interrupted. Nobody spoke. After stopping of the telescreen, the room seemed deadly silent. The seconds marched past, enormous. With difficulty Winston continued to keep his eyes fixed on O'Brien's. Then suddenly the grim face broke down into what might have been the beginnings of a smile. With his characteristic gesture, O'Brien resettled his spectacles on his nose.
Shall I say it, or will you?
He said. "I will say it," said Winston promptly. "That thing is really turned off."
Yes, everything is turned off. We are alone.
"We have come here because—" He paused, realizing that for the first time the vagueness of his own motives. Since he did not, in fact, know what kind of help he expected from O'Brien, it was not easy to say why he had come. He went on, conscious that what he was saying must sound both feeble and pretentious. "We believe that there is some kind of conspiracy, some kind of secret organization working against the party, and that you are involved in it. We want to join it and work for it. We are enemies of the party. We disbelieve the principles of Ingsoc. We are thought criminals. We are also adulterers. I tell you this because we want ourselves put at your mercy. If you want us to incriminate ourselves in any other way, we are ready." He stopped and glanced over his shoulder, with the feeling that the door had opened. Sure enough, the little yellow-faced servant had come in without knocking. Winston saw that he was carrying a tray with a decanter and glasses.
Martin is one of us, said O'Brien impassively. Bring the drinks over here, Martin. Put them on the round table. If we have enough chairs, then we may as well sit down and talk in comfort. Bring a chair for yourself, Martin. This is business. You can stop being a servant for the next 10 minutes.
The little man sat down quite at ease, and yet still with a servant-like air, the air of a valet enjoying a privilege. Winston regarded him out of the corner of his eye. It struck him that the man's whole life was playing a part, and he felt it to be dangerous to drop his assumed personality even for a moment. O'Brien took the decanter by the neck and filled up the glasses with a dark red liquid. It aroused Winston's deep memories of something he had seen long ago on a wall, where a hoarding, a vast bottle composed of electric lights would seem to move up and down and pour its contents into a glass. Seen from the top of the stuff that looked almost black, but the decanter, it just gleamed like a ruby. It had a sour, sweet smell. He saw Julia pick up her glass and sniff at it with frank curiosity.
It's called wine, said O'Brien with a faint smile. You will have read about it in books, no doubt. Not much of it gets to the outer party, I'm afraid.
His face grew solemn again, and he raised a glass.
I think it fitting that we should begin with drinking to the health of our leader, to Emmanuel Goldstein.
Winston took up his glass with a certain eagerness. Wine was a thing he had read and dreamed about. Like the glass paperweight on Mr. Charrington's half-remembered rhymes, it belonged to the vanished, romantic past, the other time he liked to call it in his secret thoughts. For some reason he had always thought of wine as having an intensely sweet taste, like that of a blackberry jam, and an immediate intoxicating effect. Actually, when he came to swallow the stuff was distinctly disappointing. The truth was that after years of drinking gin he could barely taste it. He set down the empty glass. "Is there such a person as Goldstein?" he said.
Yes, there is such a person. He is alive. Where I do not know.
"And the conspiracy, the organization, is it real? Is it not simply an invention of the thought police?"
No, it is real. The Brotherhood, we call it. You will never learn much about the Brotherhood other than it exists and that you belong to it. I will come back to that presently.
He looked at his wristwatch.
It is unwise even for members of the inner party to turn off their telescreen for more than half an hour. You ought not to have come here together, and you will have to leave separately. You, comrade, he bowed his head to Julia, you will leave first. We have about 20 minutes at our disposal. You will understand that I must be asking you certain questions. In general terms, what are you prepared to do?
"Why, anything that we are capable of," said Winston. O'Brien had turned himself a little in his chair so that he was facing Winston. He almost ignored Julia, seeming to take it for granted that Winston could speak for her. For a moment the lids flitted down over his eyes. He began asking questions in a low, expressionless voice, as though this were routine, a sort of catechism, most of whose answers were known to him already.
Are you prepared to give your lives?
"Yes."
Are you prepared to commit murder? Yes. To commit acts of sabotage which may cause the death of hundreds of innocent people? Yes. To betray your country to foreign powers? Yes. Are you prepared to cheat, to forge, to blackmail, to corrupt the minds of children, to distribute habit-forming drugs, to encourage prostitution, to disseminate venereal diseases, to do anything which is likely to cause the demoralization and weaken the power of the party?
"Yes."
If, for some example, it would serve our interests to throw sulfuric acid in a child's face, are you prepared to do that?
"Yes."
Are you prepared to lose your identity and live out the rest of your life as a waiter or a dock worker?
"Yes."
You are prepared to commit suicide if and when we order you to do so? Yes. You are prepared, the two of you, to separate and never see each other again?
"No," broke in Julia. It appeared to Winston that a long time passed before he answered. For a moment he seemed to even have been deprived of the power of speech. His tongue worked soundlessly, forming the opening syllables of the first word, then the other over and over again until he said it. He did not know which word he was going to say. "No," he said firmly.
You did well to tell me, said O'Brien. It is necessary for us to know everything.
He turned himself toward Julia and added with a voice with so much more expression in it.
Do you understand that even if he survives, it may be as a different person, we may be obliged to give him a new identity. His face, his movements, the shape of his hands, the color of his hair, even his voice would be different. You yourself might have to become a different person. Our surgeons can alter people beyond recognition. Sometimes it is necessary. Sometimes we even amputate a limb.
Winston could not help snatching another sidelong glance at Martin's Mongolian face. There were no scars they could see. Julia had turned a shade paler so that her freckles were slowing, but she faced O'Brien boldly. She murmured something that seemed to be assent. "Good.
Then it is settled.
There were a silver box of cigarettes on the table. With a rather absent-minded air, O'Brien pushed them toward the others, took one himself, then stood up and began to pace slowly to and fro as though he could think better standing. They were very good cigarettes, very thick and well packed, with an unfamiliar silkiness in the paper. O'Brien looked at his wristwatch again.
You had better go back to your pantry, Martin, he said. I shall switch on in a quarter of an hour. Take a good look at these comrades' faces before you go. You will be seeing them again. I may not.
Exactly as they had done at the front door, the little man's dark eyes flickered over their faces. There was not a trace of friendliness in his manner. He was memorizing their appearance, but he felt no interest in them, or appealed to feel none. It occurred to Winston that a synthetic face was perhaps incapable of changing its expression. Without speaking or giving any kind of salutation, Martin went out, closing the door silently behind him. O'Brien was strolling up and down, one hand in the pocket of his black overalls, the other holding a cigarette.
You understand that you will be fighting in the dark. You will always be in the dark. You will receive orders and you will obey them without knowing why. Later, I shall send you a book from which you will learn the true nature of a society we live in, and the strategy by which we shall destroy it. When you have read the book, you will be full members of the Brotherhood. But between the general aims that we are fighting for and the immediate task of the moment, you will never know anything. I tell you that the Brotherhood exists, but I cannot tell you whether it numbers 100 members or 10 million. From your personal knowledge, you will never be able to say that it numbers even as many as a dozen. You will have 3 or 4 contacts who will be renewed from time to time as they disappear. As this was your first contact, it will be preserved. When you receive orders, they will come from me. If we find it necessary to communicate with you, it will be through Martin. When you are finally caught, you will confess. It is unavoidable. But you have very little to confess other than your own actions. You will not betray more than a handful of unimportant people. Probably you will not even betray me. By that time I may be dead, or I shall have become a different person with a different face.
He continued to move to and fro over the soft carpet. In spite of the bulkiness of his body, there was a remarkable grace in his movements. It came even out of a genuine gesture, in which he thrust his hand into his pocket and manipulated a cigarette. More even than strength, he gave the impression of confidence and of understanding tinged by irony. However much in earnest he might be, he had nothing of the single-mindedness that belongs to a fanatic. When he spoke of murder, suicide, venereal disease, amputated limbs, and altered faces, it was with a faint air of persiflage. "This is unavoidable." His voice seemed to say, "This is what we've got to do," unflinchingly. "But this is not what we shall be doing when life is worth living again." A wave of admiration, almost of worship, flowed out of Winston toward O'Brien. For that moment he had forgotten about the shadowy figure of Goldstein. When you look at O'Brien's powerful shoulders and his blunt-featured face, so ugly yet so civilized, it was impossible to tell that he could be defeated. There was no stratagem that he was not equal to, no danger that he could not foresee. Even Julia seemed to be impressed. She had let her cigarette go out and was listening intently. O'Brien went on.
You've heard rumors of the existence of the Brotherhood. No doubt you've formed your own picture of it. You have imagined probably a huge world of conspirators meeting secretly in cellars, scribbling messages on walls, recognizing one another by code words or special movements of the hand. Nothing of the kind exists. The members of the Brotherhood have no way of recognizing one another, and it is impossible for anyone other to be aware of the identity of more than a very few. Goldstein himself, if he fell into the hands of the thought police, could not give them a complete list of members, or any such information that would lead them to a complete list. No such list exists. The Brotherhood cannot be wiped out because it is not an organization in any ordinary sense. Nothing holds it together except an idea which is indestructible. You never have anything to sustain you except that idea. You will get no comradeship and no encouragement. When you finally are caught, you will get no help. We never help our members. At most, when it is absolutely necessary that somebody should be silenced, we occasionally are able to smuggle a single razor blade into a prisoner's cell. You have to get used to living without results and without hope. You will work for a while, you will be caught, you will confess, and then you will die. Those are the only results you will ever see. There is no possibility that any perceptible change would happen within our own lifetime. We are the dead. This is the only true life in the future. We shall take part in it as handfuls of dust and splinters of bone. But how far away that future may be, there is no knowing. It may be 1,000 years. At present, nothing is possible except to extend the area of sanity little by little. We cannot act collectively. We can only spread our knowledge outwards from individual to individual, generation after generation. In the face of the thought police, there is no other way.
He halted and looked for the third time at his wristwatch.
It is almost time for you to leave, comrade,
He said to Julia.
wait, the decanter is still half full.
He filled his glasses and raised his own glass by the stem.
What shall it be this time?
He said, still with some faint suggestion of irony.
To the confusion of the thought police, to the death of being brother to humanity, to the future?
To the past? Said Winston.
The past is more important.
Agreed O'Brien gravely. They emptied their glasses, and a moment later, Julia stood up to go. O'Brien took a small box from the top of the cabinet and handed her a flat white tablet, which he told her to place on her tongue. It was important, he said, not to go out smelling like wine. The lieutenants were very observant. As soon as the door had shut behind her, he appeared to forget her existence. He took another pace or two up and down, then he stopped.
There are details to be settled, he said. I assume that you have a hiding place of some kind.
Winston explained about the little room over Mr. Charrington's shop.
Well, that will do for the moment. Later we will arrange something else for you. It is important to change one's hiding place frequently. Meanwhile, I shall send you a copy of the book.
Even O'Brien, Winston noticed, seemed to pronounce the words as though they were in italics.
Goldstein's book, you understand, as soon as possible. It may be some days before I can get a hold of one. There are not many in existence, as you can imagine. The thought police hunts them down and destroys them almost as fast as we can produce them. It makes very little difference. The book is indestructible. If the last copy were gone, we could reproduce it almost word for word. Do you carry a briefcase to work with you?
He added. As a rule, yes.
What's it like?
Black, very shabby, with 2 straps.
Black, 2 straps, very shabby. Good. One day in the fairly near future, I cannot give a date, one of the messages among your morning's work will contain a misprinted word, and you will have to ask for a repeat. On the following day, you will go to work without your briefcase. Sometime during that day in the street, a man will touch your arm and say, I think you have dropped your briefcase. The one he contains you will contain a copy of Goldstein's book. You will return it within 14 days.
They were silent for a moment.
There are a couple of moments before you need to go,
said O'Brien.
We shall meet again, if we do meet again.
Winston looked up at him. In a place where there is no darkness, he said hesitantly. O'Brien nodded without appearance of surprise.
In a place where there is no darkness.
He said although he recognized the illusion.
In the meantime, is there anything that you wish to say before you leave? Any message, any question?
Winston thought. There did not seem to be any further question he wanted to ask. Still less did he feel any impulse to utter high-sounding generalities. Instead of anything directly connected with O'Brien or the Brotherhood, there came into mind a sort of composite picture of the dark bedroom where his mother had spent her last days, or the little room over Mr. Charrington's shop, and the glass paperweight and a steel engraving in the rosewood frame. Almost at random, he said, Did you ever happen to hear an old rhyme that begins, Oranges and lemons, say the bells of St. Clement's? Again O'Brien nodded, with a sort of grave courtesy leave the stanza.
Oranges and lemons, say the bells of St. Clement's. You owe me 3 farthings, say the bells of St. Martin's. When will you pay me, say the bells of Old Bailey. When I grow rich, say the bells of Shoreditch.
You knew the last line, Winston said.
Yes, I knew the last line, and now I'm afraid it is time for you to go. But wait, you had better give me one of those tablets.
As Winston stood up, O'Brien held out a hand. His powerful grip crushed the bones in Winston's palm. At the door, Winston looked back, but O'Brien seemed already to be in the process of putting him out of mind. He was waiting with his hand on a switch that controlled the telescreen. Beyond him, Winston could see the writing table with its green shaded lamp, the speakwrite, and the wire baskets deep laden with papers. The incident was closed. Within 30 seconds it occurred to him O'Brien would be back at his interrupted important work on behalf of the party.
Oh, God. Turn up, turn up, turn up.
It's Virgo season. Even though Orwell's a Cancer, it's Virgo season, and we need you to give me suggestions for Virgo writers, because we all love our Virgo writers. You know, Tolstoy.
Oh, yeah.
There's nothing.
Do I did it?
I just wanna flow the mirror. We can find a place I know. I just wanna roll. Just let me roll. We can find a place I know. Computer. Okay, that was your Zapp and Roger break. Shouts out to Against the World. Shouts out to Don't Watch Continue, Dog Rose. Shouts out to all the fine folks over at the r/alternate history hub Discord. Oh man. Just all of the love. Oh, shouts out Octa Wave. Shouts out Rock Keep It Rit. Shouts out Marie. I'm sleepy already, but I feel like I could get a whole lot more reading done. Chapter 9. Winston was gelatinous with fatigue. Gelatinous was the right word. It colored his head spontaneously. His body seemed to not only have the weakness of jelly, but its translucency. He felt that if he held up his hand, he would be able to see the light through it. All the body and lymph had been drained out of him by an enormous debauch of work, leaving only a frail structure of nerves, bones, and skin. All sensations seemed to have been magnified. His overalls fretted his shoulders, the pavement tickled his feet. Even the opening and closing of his hand was an effort that made his joints creak. He had worked more than 90 hours in 5 days. So had everyone else in the ministry. Now it was all over, and he had literally nothing to do. No party work of any description until tomorrow morning. He could spend 6 hours in the hiding place, and another 9 in his own bed. Slowly, in mid-afternoon sunshine, he walked up a dingy street in the direction of Mr. Carrington's shop, keeping one eye open for the patrols, but irrationally convinced that this afternoon there was no danger of anyone interfering in. The heavy briefcase that he was carrying bumped against his knee at each step, sending a tingling sensation up and down the skin of his leg. Inside it was a book, which he had now in his possession for 6 days and had not yet opened nor even looked at. On the 6th day of 8 weeks after the processions, the speeches, the shouting, the singing, the banters, the posters, the films, the waxworks, the rolling of drums, the squealing of trumpets, the tramp of marching feet, the grinding of caterpillar tanks, the roar of massed plants, the booming of guns. After 6 days of this, when the great orgasm was quivering to its climax, and the general hatred of Eurasia had boiled up into such a delirium that the crowd could have got to their hands on the 2,000 Eurasian war criminals who were about to be publicly hanged on the last day of the proceedings, they would unquestionably have torn them to pieces. At just this moment it had been announced that Oceania was not, after all, at war with Eurasia. Oceania was at war with Eastasia. Eurasia was now an ally. There was, of course, no admission that any change had taken place. Merely it became known with extreme suddenness and everywhere at once that Eastasia was not Eurasia, and Eastasia was the enemy. Winston was taking part in a demonstration in one of the central London squares at the moment that it happened. It was night, and the white faces and the scarlet banners were luridly floodlit. The square was packed with several thousand people, including a block of about 1,000 school children in the uniform of the spies there. On a scarlet-draped platform, an orator of the inner party, a small, lean man with disproportionately long arms and large, bald skull over which a few lank locks straggled, was haranguing the crowd. A little Rumpelstiltskin finger, contorted with hatred, was griped at the neck of the microphone, with one hand on the other of the enormous end of a bony arm clawed menacingly above his head. His voice, made metallic by amplifiers, boomed forth an endless catalogue of atrocities, massacres, deportations, lootings, rapings, torture, prisoners, bombing of civilians, lying propaganda, unjust aggressions, broken treaties. It was almost impossible to listen to him without being convinced and then very maddened. At every few moments the fury of the crowd boiled over, and the voice of the speaker was drowned like a wild, beast-like roaring noise that rose uncomfortably from thousands of throats. The most savage yells all came from the school children. The speech had been proceeding all of perhaps 20 minutes when the messenger hurried onto the platform, and a scrap of paper was slipped into the speaker's hand. He unrolled and read it without pausing in his speech. Nothing altered in his voice or manner, or the content of what he was saying, but suddenly the names were different. Without words said, a wave of understanding rippled through the crowd. Oceania was at war with Eastasia. The next moment there was tremendous commotion. The banners and posters with which the square was decorated were all wrong. Quite half of them were with the wrong faces on them. It was sabotage. The agents of Goldstein had been at work. There were riotous interlude where protesters ripped the posters from walls, banners torn to shreds and trampled underfoot. The spies performed prodigies of activity in clambering over the rooftops and cutting the streamers that flooded over the chimneys. But within 2 or 3 minutes it was all over, the orator still grabbing the neck of the microphone. His shoulders hunched forward, his free hand clawing at the air, had gone straight on with his speech. 1 minute more and the feral roars of rage were again bursting from the crowd. The hate continued exactly as before, except that the target had been changed. The thing that impressed Winston, looking back, was that the speaker had switched from one line to the other, actually in mid-sentence, not only without a pause, but without even breaking the syntax. But at that moment he had other things to preoccupy him. It was during the moment of disorder, while the protesters were being torn down, that a man whose face he did not see had tapped him on the shoulder and said,
Excuse me, I think you dropped your briefcase.
He took the briefcase abstractedly without speaking. He knew there would be days before he had an opportunity to look inside it. The instant that the demonstration was over, he went straight into the Ministry of Truth. Though the time was now nearly 23 hours, the entire staff of the ministry had done likewise. The orders already issuing from the telescreens recalling them to their posts were hardly necessary. Oceania was at war with East Asia. Oceania had always been at war with East Asia. A large part of the political literature of the 5 years now was completely obsolete. Reports and records of all kinds, newspapers, books, pamphlets, films, soundtracks, photographs, all had to be rectified at lightning speed. Although no directive was ever issued, it was known that the chiefs of the department intended that within 1 week, no reference to the war with Eurasia or the alliance with East Asia should remain in existence anywhere. The work was overwhelming, all the more so because the process that involved it could not be called by their true names. Everyone in the records department worked 18 hours in the 24, with 2 3-hour snatches of sleep. Mattresses were brought up from the cellars and pitched all over the corridors. Meals consisted of sandwiches and victory coffee rounded up on trolleys by attendants from the canteen. Each time that Winston broke off for one of his spells of sleep, he tried to leave his desk clear of work, and each time he crawled back, sticky-eyed, making it was to find another shower of paper cylinders that covered the desk like a snowdrift, half burying it, speak right, and overflowing onto the floor. So the first job was always to stack them into a neat enough pile to give him room to work. What was worst of all was that the work was by no means purely mechanical. Often it was enough merely to substitute one name for another, but any detailed report of events demanded care and imagination. Even the geographical knowledge that one needed in transferring the war from one part of the world to another was considerable. By the third day his eyes ached unbearably and his spectacles needed wiping every few minutes. It was like struggling with some crushing physical task, something which one had the right to refuse, which one was nevertheless neurotically anxious to accomplish. And so far as he had time to remember, he was not troubled by the fact that every word he murmured into the speakwrite, every stroke of his ink pencil was a deliberate lie. He was anxious as anyone else in the department of forgery should be perfect. In the morning of the 6th day, he dribbled the cylinders, slowed down. For as much as half an hour, nothing came out of the tube. Then one more cylinder, then nothing. Everywhere at about the same time, the work was easing off. A deep and as it was secret sigh went through the department. A mighty deed which could never be mentioned had been achieved. It was now impossible for any human being to prove by documentary evidence that the war with Eurasia had ever happened. At 1200, it was unexpectedly announced that all workers in the ministry were free till tomorrow morning. Winston, still carrying the briefcase containing the book, which had remained between his feet while he worked and under his body while he slept, went home, shaved himself, and almost fell asleep in his bath, although the water was barely more than tepid. With a sort of voluptuous creaking in his joints, he climbed the stair above Mr. Charrington's shop. He was tired, but would not sleep any longer. He opened the window and lit the dirty little oil stove, put a pan of water for coffee. Julia would arrive presently. Meanwhile, there was the book. He sat down in the sluttish armchair and undid the straps of his briefcase. A heavy black volume, amateurishly bound with no name or title on the cover. The print also looked slightly irregular. The pages were worn at the edges and fell apart easily as though the whole book had passed through many hands. The inscription on the title page ran, "The Theory and Practice of Oligarchical Collectivism by Emmanuel Goldstein." Winston began reading. Chapter 1, Ignorance is Strength. Throughout recorded time, and probably since the end of the Neolithic Age, there have been 3 kinds of people in the world: the high, the middle, and the low. They have been subdivided in many ways. They have been borne countless different names, and all their relative numbers, as well as their attitude toward one another, have varied from age to age. But the essential structure of society has never altered. Even after enormous upheavals and seemingly irrevocable changes, the same pattern has always reasserted itself, just as a gyroscope will always return to the equilibrium, however far it is pushed one way or the other. The aims of these three groups are entirely irreconcilable. Winston stopped reading chiefly in order to appreciate the fact that he was reading in comfort and safety. He was alone, no telescreen, no ear at the keyhole, no nervous impulse to glance over his shoulder and cover the page with his hand. Sweet summer air played against his cheek. From somewhere far away there floated the faint shouts of children. In the room itself there was no sound except the insect voice of the clock. He settled deeper into the armchair and put his feet up on the fender. It was bliss. It was eternity. Suddenly, as one sometimes does with a book which one knows that one will ultimately read and reread every word, he opened it at a different place and found himself at the third chapter. He went on reading. Chapter 3. War is Peace. The splitting up of the world into three great superstates was an event which could be, and indeed was foreseen before the middle of the 20th century. With the absorption of Europe by Russia and the British Empire by the United States, two of the three existing powers, Eurasia and Oceania, were already effectively in being. The third, East Asia, only emerged as a distinct unit after another decade of confused fighting. The frontiers between the three superstates are in some places arbitrary, and in others they fluctuate according to the fortunes of war, but in general they follow geographical lines. Eurasia comprises of the whole of the northern part of the European and Asiatic landmasses, from Portugal to the Bering Straits. Oceania comprises the Americas, the Atlantic Islands, including the British Isles, Australasia, and the southern portion of Africa. East Asia, smaller than the others, and with less definite western frontier, comprises China and the countries to the south of it, the Japanese islands, and a large but fluctuating portion of Manchuria, Mongolia, and Tibet. In one combination or another, these three superstates are permanently at war, and have been so presently for 25 years. However, war is no longer the desperate, annihilating struggle that it was in the early decades of the 20th century. It is a warfare of limited aims between combatants who are unable to destroy one another. They have no material cause for fighting, and are not divided by any genuine ideological difference. This is not to say that either the conduct of war or the privilege of attitude toward it has become less bloodthirsty or more chivalrous. On the contrary, war hysteria is continuous and universal in all countries, and such acts as rape, looting, and the slaughter of children, and the reduction of whole populations to slavery, and reprisals against prisoners which extend even to boiling and burying alive, are looked upon as normal when they are committed by one's own side, and not by enemy meritorious. But in a physical sense, war involves very small numbers of people, most highly trained specialists, and causes comparatively few casualties. The fighting, when there is any, takes place on vague frontiers, whose whereabouts the average man can only guess at, or around floating fortresses which guard strategic spots on the sea lanes. In the centers of civilization, war means no more than a continuous shortage of consumption goods, and the occasional crash of a rocket bomb which may cause a few scores of deaths. War has in fact changed its character. More exactly, the reasons for which war is waged have changed in the order of importance. The motives which were already present to some small extent in the great wars of the early 20th century have now become dominant, and are consciously recognized and acted upon. To understand the nature of the present war, for in spite of regrouping which one occurs every few years, it is always the same war. One must realize, in the first place, that it is impossible for it to be decisive. None of the three super-states could be definitely conquered, even by the other two in combination. They are too evenly matched, and their natural defenses are too formidable. Eurasia is protected by its vast land spaces, Oceania by the width of the Atlantic and the Pacific. East Asia by the fecundity and industriousness of its inhabitants. Secondly, there is no longer, in material sense, anything to fight about, with the establishment of self-contained economies in which production and consumption are geared to one another. The scramble for markets, which was a main cause of previous wars, has come to an end, while the competition for raw materials is no longer a matter of life and death. In any case, each of the three superstates is so vast that it can obtain almost all of the materials that it needs within its own boundaries. And so far as the war has a direct economic purpose, it is a war for labor power. Between the frontiers of the superstates, and not permanently in the possession of any of them, there lies a rough quadrilateral with its corners in Tangier, Brazzaville, Darwin, and Hong Kong, containing within it about a fifth of the population of the earth. It is for this possession, that these thickly populated regions and northern ice cap, that the three powers are constantly struggling. In practice, no one ever controls the whole of the disputed area. Portions of it are constantly changing hands, and it is the chance of seizing this or that fragment by a sudden stroke of treachery that dictates the endless changes of alignment. All the disputed territories contain valuable minerals, and some of them yield important vegetable products, such as rubber, which in colder climates is necessary to synthesize by comparatively expensive methods. But above all, they contain a bottomless reserve of cheap labor. Whichever power controls equatorial Africa, or the countries of the Middle East, or southern India, or the Indonesian archipelago, disposes also of the bodies of scores of hundreds of millions of ill-paid and hard-working coolies. The inhabitants of this areas, reduced more or less openly to the status of slaves, pass continually from conqueror to conqueror, and are expended so much like coal or oil in the race to turn out more armaments, to capture more territory, to control more labor power, to turn out more armaments, to capture more territory, and so on indefinitely. It should be noted that the fighting never really moves beyond the edges of the disputed areas. The frontiers of Eurasia flow back and forth between the basin of the Congo and the northern shore of the Mediterranean. The islands of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific are constantly being captured and recaptured by Oceania or East Asia. In Mongolia, the dividing line between Eurasia and East Asia, is never stable. Around the pole, all three powers lay claim to enormous territories, which are in fact largely uninhabited and unexplored. But the balance of power always remains roughly even, and the territory which forms the heartland of each superstate always remains indolent. Moreover, the labor of the exploited peoples round the equator is not really necessary to the world's economy. They add nothing to the wealth of the world, since whatever they produce is used for the purposes of the war, and the object of waging war is always to be in a better position in which to wage another war. By their labor, the slave populations allow the tempo of continuous warfare to be speeded up. But if they did not exist, the structure of world society and the process by which it maintains itself would not be essentially different. The primary aim of modern warfare, in accordance with the principles of doublethink, the aim is simultaneously recognized and not recognized by the directing brains of the inner party, is used up in the products of the machines without raising the general standard of living. Ever since the end of the 19th century, the problem of what to do with the surplus of consumption goods has been latent in industrial society. At present, when few human beings even have enough to eat, this problem obviously not urgent, but it might not have become so even if no artificial processes of destruction had been at work. The world today is a bare, hungry, dilapidated place compared with the world that existed before 1914, and still more so if compared with the imaginary future to which people of that period looked forward to. In the early 20th century, the vision of the future society, unbelievably rich, leisured, orderly, and efficient, a glittering, antiseptic world of glass and steel and snow-white concrete, was part of the consciousness of nearly every literate person. Science and technology were developing at prodigious speed, and it seemed natural to assume that they would go on developing. This failed to happen partially because of the impoverishment caused by a long series of wars and revolutions, partially because of scientific and technical progress demanded on the empirical habit of thought, which could not survive in a strictly regimented society. As the whole world is more primitive today than it is 50 years ago, certain backwater areas have advanced, and various devices, always in some ways connected with warfare and police espionage, have been developed. But experiment and invention have largely stopped, and the ravages of the atomic war of the 1950s have never been fully repaired. Nevertheless, the dangers inherent in the machine are still there. For the moment when the machine first made its appearance, it was clear to all thinking people that the need for human drudgery, and therefore to a great extent for human inequality, had disappeared. If the machine were used deliberately for that end, hunger, overwork, dirt, illiteracy, and disease could be eliminated within a few generations, and in fact without being used for any such purpose, but by a sort of automatic process, by producing wealth which it was sometimes impossible not to distribute. The machine did raise the living standards of the average human being very greatly over a period of about 50 years at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries. It was also clear that an all-around increase in the wealth threatened by the destruction, indeed, in some sense, the destruction of a hierarchical society. In a world in which everyone worked short hours, had enough to eat, lived in a house with a bathroom and a refrigerator, and possessed a motor car or even an airplane, the most obvious and perhaps most important form of inequality would have already disappeared. If it once became general, wealth would have no distinction. It was possible, no doubt, to imagine a society in which wealth, in the sense of personal possessions and luxuries, should be evenly distributed, while power remained in the hands of a small privileged caste. But in practice such a society could not remain stable. For if leisure and security were enjoyed by all alike, a great mass of human beings who are normally stupefied by poverty would become literate and would learn to think for themselves. And when once they had done this, they would sooner or later realize that privileged minority had no function, and they would sweep it away. In the long run, a hierarchical society was only possible on the basis of poverty and ignorance. To return to an agricultural past, as some thinkers about the beginning of the 20th century dreamed of doing, was not a practical solution. It conflicted with the tendency towards mechanization, which had become quasi-instinctive throughout almost the whole world, and moreover any country which remained industrially backward was helpless in a military sense, and was bound to be dominated directly or indirectly by its more advanced rivals. Nor is it a satisfactory solution to keep the masses in poverty by restricting the output of goods. This happened to be great during the ascent of the final phase of capitalism, roughly 1920 and 1940. The economy of many countries was allowed to stagnate. Land went out of cultivation, capital equipment was not added to, great blocks of the population were prevented from working, and kept half alive by state charity. But this too entitled military weakness, and since privations it inflicted were obviously unnecessary, it made opposition inevitable. The problem was how to keep the wheels of industry turning without increasing the real wealth of the world. Goods must be produced, but they need not be distributed, and in practice the only way of achieving this was by continuous warfare. The essential act of war is destruction, not necessarily of human lives, but of the products of human labor. War is a way of shattering to pieces or pouring into the stratosphere or sinking into the depths of the sea materials which might otherwise be used to make the masses too comfortable, and hence, in the long run, too intelligent. Even when weapons of war are not actually destroyed, their manufacture is still a convenient way of expending labor power without producing anything that can be consumed. A floating fortress, for example, has locked up in it the labor that would build several hundred cargo ships. Ultimately, it is scrapped as obsolete, never having brought any material benefit to anybody, and with further enormous labors, another floating fortress is built. In principle, the war effort is always so planned as to eat up any surplus that might exist after meeting the bare needs of the population. In practice, the needs of the population are always underestimated, with the result that there is a chronic shortage of half of the necessities of life. But this is looked on as an advantage. It is a deliberate policy to keep even the favored group somewhere near the brink of hardship, because the general state of scarcity increases the importance of small privileges, and thus magnifies the distinction between one group and another. By the standards of the early 20th century, even a member of the inner party lives an austere, laborious kind of life. Nevertheless, the few luxuries that he does enjoy, his large, well-appointed flat, the better texture of his clothes, the better quality of his food and drink, his 2 or 3 servants, his private motor car, helicopter, set him in a different world from a member of the outer party, and the members of the outer party a similar advantage in comparison with the submerged masses whom we call the proles. The social atmosphere is that of a besieged city, where the possession of a lump of horseflesh makes the difference between wealth and poverty. At the same time, the consciousness of being at war and therefore in danger makes the handling over of all power to a small caste seem the natural, unavoidable condition of survival. War, it will be seen, not only accomplishes the necessary destruction, but accomplishes it in a psychologically acceptable way. In principle, it would be quite simple to waste the surplus of labor of the world by building temples and pyramids, by digging holes and filling them up again, or even by producing vast quantities of goods and setting fire to them. But this would provide only the economic aid, and not the emotional basis for a hierarchical society. What is concerned here is not the morale of the masses, whose attitude is unimportant so long as they are kept steadily at work, but the morale of the party itself. Even the humblest party member is expected to be competent, industrious, and even intelligent within narrow limits. But it is also necessary that he should be a credulous and ignorant fanatic whose prevailing moods are fear, hatred, adulation, and orgasmic triumph. In other words, it is necessary that he should have the mentality appropriate to a state of war. It does not matter whether war is actually happening, and since no decisive victory is possible, it does not matter whether one war is going well or badly. All that is needed is that a state of war should exist. The splitting of intelligence which the party requires of its members, and which is more easily achieved by a higher atmosphere of war, is now almost universal. But the higher up in the ranks one goes, the more marked it becomes. It is precisely the inner party that war hysteria and hatred of the enemy are the strongest. In his capacity as an administrator, it is often necessary for a member of the inner party to know that this or that item of war news is untruthful, and he may be often aware that the entire war is spurious and is either not happening or being waged for purposes quite other than the declared ones. But such knowledge is easily neutralized by the technique of doublethink. Meanwhile, no inter-party member waves for an instant in his mystical belief that the war is real, and that it is bound to end victoriously with Oceania as the undisputed master of the entire world. All members of the inner party believe that this coming inquest is actually an article of faith. It is to be achieved either gradually acquiring more and more territory, and so building up an overwhelming preponderance of power, or by the discovery of some new and unanswerable weapon. The search for new weapons continues unceasingly, and is one of the very few remaining activities in which the intentive or speculative type of mind can find any outlet. In Oceania in the present day, science in the old sense has almost ceased to exist. In newspeak there is no word for science. The empirical method of thought on which all scientific advancements of the past were founded is opposed to the most fundamental principles of Ingsoc, and even technological process only happens when its products can in some way be used for the diminution of human liberty. In all useful arts the world is either standing still or going backwards. Fields are cultivated with horse plows while books are written by machinery. But in matters of vital importance, meaning, in effect, war and police espionage, the empirical approach is still encouraged or at least tolerated. The two aims of the party are to conquer the whole surface of the earth and to extinguish once and for all the possibility of independent thought. There are therefore two great problems which the party are concerned to solve. One is how to discover against his will which another human being is thinking. The other is how to kill several 100 million people in a few seconds without giving warning beforehand. Insofar as scientific research continues, this is its subject matter. Science of today is either a mixture of a psychologist and an inquisitor studying with extraordinary minuteness the meaning of facial expressions, gestures, tones of voice, and testing the truth-producing effects of drugs, shock therapy, hypnosis, and physical torture, or he is a chemist, physicist, or biologist concerned only with such branches of a special subject as are relevant to the taking of life. In the vast laboratories of the Ministry of Peace, in the experimental stations hidden in the Brazilian forests, in the Australian desert, or on the lost islands of the Antarctic, the teams of experts are indefatigably at work. Some are concerned simply with planning of the logistics of future wars. Others devise larger and larger rocket bombs, more and more powerful explosives, and more impenetrable armor plating. Others search for new and deadlier gases, or for soluble poisons capable of being produced in such quantities as to destroy the vegetation of a whole continent, or for breeds of disease germs immunized against all possible antibodies. Wait, what? uh, Others strive to produce a vehicle that shall bore its way under the soil like a submarine under the water, or an airplane as independent of its base as a sailing ship. Others explore even remoter possibilities, such as focusing the sun's rays through lenses suspended thousands of kilometers away in space, or producing an artificial earthquake or tidal wave by tapping into the heat at the Earth's center. But none of these projects ever comes anywhere near realization, and none of the three superstates ever gains a significant lead on the others. Was more remarkable. Excuse me. What is more remarkable is that all three powers already possess, in the atomic bombs, a weapon far more powerful than any that their present researchers are likely to discover. Although the party, according to its habit, claims invention for itself, atomic bombs first appeared as early as the 1940s. They were first used on a large scale about 10 years later. At that time, some hundreds of bombs were dropped on industrial centers, chiefly in European Russia, Western Europe, and North America. The effect was to convince the ruling groups of all countries that a few more atomic bombs would mean the end of organized society, and hence of their own power. Thereafter, although no formal agreement was ever made or hinted at, no bombs were ever dropped. All three powers merely continue to produce atomic bombs and store them up against the decisive opportunity, which they all believe will come sooner or later. Meanwhile, the art of war has remained almost stationary for 30 or 40 years. Helicopters are more used than they were formerly. Bombing planes have largely been superseded by self-propelled projectiles. Fragile, movable battleship has given way to an almost unsinkable floating fortress. But otherwise, there has been little development. The tank, the submarine, the torpedo, the machine gun, even the rifle, and the hand grenade are still in use, in spite of the endless slaughters reported in the press on the telescreens. The desperate battles of earlier wars, in which thousands or even millions of men were often killed in a few weeks, have never been repeated. None of the three superstates ever attempts any maneuver which involves the risk of serious defeat. When any large operation is undertaken, it is usually a surprise attack against an ally. The strategy that all three powers are following, or pretend to themselves that they are following, is the same. The plan by a combination of fighting, bargaining, and well-timed strokes of treachery to acquire a ring of bases completely encircling one or the other rival states. and then signed a pact of friendship with that rival and to remain on peaceful terms for so many years as to lull suspicion to sleep. During this time, rockets loaded with many atomic bombs can be assembled at all the strategic spots. Finally, they will all be fired simultaneously, with effects so devastating as to make retaliation impossible. It will then be time to sign a pact of friendship with the remaining world power in preparation for another attack. This scheme, it is hardly necessary to say, is a mere daydream, impossible of realization. Moreover, no fighting ever occurs except in the disputed areas round the equator and the pole. No invasion of enemy territory is ever undertaken. This explains the fact that in some places the frontiers between superstates are arbitrary. Eurasia, for example, could easily conquer the British Isles, which are geographically part of Europe. Or on the other hand, it would be possible for Oceania to push its frontiers to the Rhine or even to the Vistula. This would violate the principle, followed on all sides through though never formulated cultural integrity. If Oceania were to conquer the areas that once used to be known as France and Germany, it would be necessary either to exterminate the inhabitants, a task of great physical difficulty, or to assimilate a population of about 100 million people who, so far as technological development goes, are roughly on the oceanic level. The problem is the same for all three superstates. It is absolutely necessary to their structure that there should be no contact with foreigners except to a limited extent with war prisoners and colored slaves. Even the official ally of the monument is always regarded with the darkest suspicion. War prisoners apart, the average citizen of Oceania never sets eyes on a citizen of either Eurasia or East Asia, and he is forbidden the knowledge of foreign languages. If he were allowed contact with foreigners, he would discover that they are creatures similar to himself, and that most of what he has been told about them are lies. The sealed world in which he lives would be broken, and the fear, hatred, and self-righteousness on which his morale depends might evaporate. It is therefore realized on all sides, however, that Persia or Egypt or Java or Ceylon might change hands. The main frontiers must never be crossed by anything except bombs. I don't know why having sub for sub in the title wouldn't be safe Octawave, but shouts out Octawave. Been shouting you out. Under this lies a fact never mentioned aloud, but tacitly understood and acted upon, namely that the conditions of life in all three superstates are very much the same. In Oceania, the prevailing philosophy is called Ingsoc. In Eurasia, it is called Neo-Bolshevism. In East Asia, it is called by a Chinese name that usually translates as death worship, but perhaps rendered as obliteration of the self. The citizen of Oceania is not allowed to know anything of the tenets of the other two philosophies, but he is taught to extricate them as barbarous outrages upon morality and common sense. Actually, the three philosophies are barely distinguishable, and all the social systems which they support are not distinguishable at all. Everywhere there is the same pyramid structure, the same worship of a semi-divine leader, and the same economy existing by and for continuous warfare. It follows that the three superstates not only cannot conquer one another, but would gain no advantage by doing so. On the contrary, so long as they remain in conflict, they prop one another up, like three sheaves of corn. And as usual, the ruling groups of all three powers are simultaneously aware and unaware of what they are doing. Their lives are dedicated to world conquest, but they also know that it is necessary that the war should continue everlastingly without victory. Meanwhile, the fact that there is no danger of conquest makes it possible the denial of reality, which is the special feature of Ingsoc and its rival system's thought. Here it is necessary to repeat what has been said earlier, that by becoming continuous, war has fundamentally changed its character. In past ages, a war, almost by definition, was something that sooner or later came to an end, usually in an unmistakable victory or defeat. Also in past, war was one of the main instruments by which human societies were kept in touch with physical reality. The rulers of all ages have tried to impose a false view of the world upon their followers, but they could not afford to encourage any illusion that tended to to impair military efficiency. So long as defeat meant the loss of independence or some other result generally held to be undesirable, the precautions against defeat had to be serious. Physical facts could not be ignored. In philosophy or religion or ethics or politics, 2 and 2 might make 5, but when one was designing a gun or an airplane, they had to make 4. Inefficient nations were always conquered sooner or later, and the struggle for efficiency was chemical to illusions. Moreover, to be efficient, it was necessary to be able to learn from the past, which meant having a fairly accurate idea of what had happened in the past. Newspapers and history books were, of course, always colored and biased, but falsification of this kind that is practiced today would have been impossible. War was a sure safeguard for sanity, and so far the ruling classes were concerned, it was probably the most important of all safeguards. While wars could be won or lost, no ruling class could be completely irresponsible. But when war becomes literally continuous, it also ceases to be dangerous. When war is continuous, there is no such thing as military necessity. Technical progress can cease, and most palpable facts can be denied or disregarded. As we have seen, researches that could be called scientific are still carried out for the purposes of war, but they are essentially a kind of daydreaming, and their failure to show results is not important. Efficiency, even military efficiency, is no longer needed. Nothing is efficient except the thought police. Since each of the 3 superstates is unconquerable, each is in effect a separate universe, within which almost any perversion of thought can be safely practiced. Reality only exerts its pressure through the needs of everyday life. The need to eat and drink, to get shelter and clothing, to avoid swallowing poison or stepping out of 2-story windows and the like. Between life and death, between physical pleasure and physical pain, there is still a distinction, but that is all. Cut off from contact from the outer world, and with the past, the citizen of Oceania is like a man in interstellar space who has no way of knowing which direction is up or which is down. The rulers of such a state are absolute as the pharaohs or the Caesars could be. They are obliged to prevent their followers from starving to death in numbers large enough to be inconvenient, as they are obliged to remain at the same low level of military technique as their rivals. Once that minimum is achieved, they can twist reality into whatever shape they choose. The war, therefore, if we judge it by the standards of previous wars, is merely an imposture. It is like the battles between certain ruminant animals with horns set at an angle that they are incapable of hurting one another. But though it is unreal, it is not meaningless. It ends up with surplus of consumable goods and helps preserve the special mental atmosphere that a social, hierarchical society needs. War, it will be seen, is now purely internal affair. In the past, the ruling groups of all countries, although they might recognize their common interests and therefore limit the destructiveness of a war, did fight against one another, and the victor always plundered the vanquished. In our own day, they are not fighting against one another at all. The war is waged by each ruling group against its own subjects, and the object of the war is not to make or prevent conquest of territory, but to keep the structure of society intact. The very word war, therefore, has become misleading. It would probably be accurate to say that by becoming continuous, war has ceased to exist. The peculiar pressure that it exerted on human beings between the Neolithic age and the early 20th century has disappeared and has been replaced by something quite different. The effect will be much the same if the 3 superstates, instead of fighting one another, should agree to live in perpetual peace, each inviolate with its own boundaries. For in that case each would still be a self-contained universe, freed forever from the sobering influence of external danger. The peace that was truly permanent would be the same as a permanent war. This, although the vast majority of the party members understand it only in a shallower sense, is the inner meaning of the party slogan, "War is peace." Winston stopped reading for a moment. Somewhere in the remote distance a rocket bomb thundered. The blissful feeling of being alone with a forbidden book in a room with no telescreen had not worn off. Solitude and safety were the physical sensations mixed up somehow in the tiredness of his own body, the softness of the chair, the faint breeze from the window that played upon his cheek. The book fascinated him. More exactly, it reassured him. In a sense, it told him nothing that was new, but that was part of the attraction. It said what he would have said if it had been possible for him to set his scattered thoughts in order. It was a product of a mind similar to his own, but enormously more powerful, more systematic, less fear-ridden. The best books, he perceived, are those that tell you what you already know. He just turned back to chapter 1 when he heard Julia's footstep on the stair and started out of his own chair to meet her. She dumped her brown tool bag on the floor and flung herself into his arms. It was more than a week since they had seen each other. "I've got the book," he said, and they disentangled themselves. "Oh, you've got it? Good," she said without much interest. It was almost immediately knelt down beside the oil stove to make coffee. They had not returned to the subject until they had been in bed for half an hour. The evening was just cool enough to make it worth while to pull up the counterpane. From below came the sound of singing and the scrape of boots on the flagstones. The brawny, red-armed woman whom Winston had seen there on his first visit was almost a fixture in the yard. There seemed to be no honor, daylight, when she was not marching to and fro between the washtub and the line, alternately gagging herself with the clothes pegs and breaking forth into lusty song. Julia had settled down on her side and seemed to be already on the point of falling asleep. He reached out for the book, which was lying on the floor, and sat up against the bed head. "We must read it," he said. "You too. All members of the Brotherhood have read it." "You read it," she said with her eyes shut. "Read it aloud. It is the best way. Then you can explain it to me as you go." The clock's hand said 6, meaning 18. They had 3 or 4 hours ahead of them. He propped the book against his knees and began reading. Chapter 1. Ignorance is strength. Throughout record time, probably since the end of Neolithic age, there have been 3 kinds of people in this world: the high, the middle, and the low. They have been subdivided in many ways. They have borne countless different names. Their relative numbers as well as their attitude toward one another have varied from age to age. But the essential structure of society is never altered. Even after enormous upheavals and seemingly irrevocable changes, the same pattern has always reasserted itself, just as the gyroscope will always return to equilibrium, however far as it is pushed away from one another. "Julia, are you awake?" said Winston. "Yes, my love, I'm listening. Go on. It's marvelous." He continued reading. The aims of these 3 groups is entirely irreconcilable. The aim of the high is to remain where they are. The aim of the middle is to change places with the high. And the aim of the low, when they have an aim, is for an abiding characteristic of the low. They are too much crushed by the drudgery to be more than intermittently conscious of anything outside of their daily lives. It is to abolish all distinctions and create a society when all men shall be equal. Thus throughout history a struggle which is the same as its main outlines reoccurs over and over again. For long periods the high seem to be securely in power, but sooner or later there always comes a moment when they either lose their belief in themselves or their capacity to govern efficiently, or both. They are then overthrown by the middle, who enlist the low on their side by pretending that they are fighting for liberty and justice. As soon as they have reached their objective, the middle thrusts the low back into their old position of servitude and themselves become the high. Presently a new middle group splits off from one of the other groups, or from both of them, and the struggle begins over again. Of the 3 groups, only the low are never even temporarily successful in achieving their aims. It would be an exaggeration to say that throughout history there has been no progress of a material kind. Even today, in a period of decline, the average human being is better physically than he was a few centuries ago. But no advance in wealth, no softening of manners, no reform or revolution has brought any human equality a millimeter nearer. From the point of view of the low, no historic change has ever meant much more than a change in the name of their masters. By the late 19th century, the recurrence of this pattern had become obvious to many observers. There then arose schools of thinkers who interpreted history as a cyclical process and claimed to show that inequality was an unalterable law of human life. This doctrine, of course, had always had its adherents, but in the manner in which it was now put forward there was a significant change. In the past, the need for a hierarchical form of society had always been the doctrine specifically of the high. It had been preached by kings and aristocrats and by the priests and lawyers and the like, who were parasitical upon them. It had generally been softened by promises of compensation and an imaginary world beyond the grave. The middle, so long as it was struggling for power, had always made use of such terms as freedom, justice, and fraternity. Now, however, the concept of human brotherhood began to be assailed by people who were not yet in positions of command, who merely hoped to be so before long. In the past, the middle had made revolutions under the banner of equality and then established a fresh tyranny as soon as the old one was overthrown. The new middle groups in the effect proclaimed their tyranny beforehand. Socialism, a theory which appeared in the early 19th century and was the last link in a chain of thought stretching back to the slave rebellions of antiquity, was still deeply infected by the utopianism of the past ages. But in each variant of socialism that appeared from about 1900s onwards, the aim of established liberty and equality was more and more openly abandoned. The new movements which appeared to be in the middle years of the century, Ingsoc in Oceania, Neo-Bolshevism in Eurasia, and death worship as it is commonly called in East Asia, had the conscientious aim of perpetuating unfreedom and inequality. These moves, of course, grew out of the old ones and tended to keep their names and pay lip service to their ideology. But the purpose of all of them was to arrest progress and freeze history at a chosen moment. The familiar pendulum swing was to happen once more and then stop. As usual, the high were to be turned out by the middle, who would then become the high, but this time, by conscious strategy, the high would be able to maintain their position permanently. The new doctrines arose partly because of the accumulation of historical knowledge and the growth of the historical sense which had hardly existed before the 19th century. The cynical movement of history was now intelligible, or appeared to be so, and if it was intelligible, it was already alterable. But the principal underlying cause was that as early as the beginning of the 20th century, human equality had become technically possible. It was still true that men were not equal in their native talents, and their functions had to be specialized in ways that favored some individuals against others, but there was no longer any real need for class distinctions or for large differences of wealth. In earlier ages, class distinctions had not only been inevitable but desirable. Inequality was the price of civilization. With the development of machine production, however, the case was altered. Even if it was necessary for human beings to do different kinds of work, it was no longer necessary for them to live at different social or economic levels. Therefore, from the point of view of new groups who were on the point of seizing power, human inequality was no longer an ideal to be striven after, but the danger to be averted. In more primitive ages, when a just and peaceful society was in fact not possible, it had been fairly easy to believe in it. The idea of an earthly paradise in which men should live together in a state of brotherhood, without laws and without brute force, had haunted the human imagination for thousands of years, and its vision had been certain to hold even onto the groups who actually profited by each historic change. The heirs of the French, English, and American revolutions had partly believed their own phrases about the rights of man, freedom of speech, equality before law, and the like. They had even allowed their conduct to be influenced by them to some extent. By the fourth decade of the 20th century, all the main currents in political thought were authoritarian. The earthly paradise had been discredited at exactly the moment when it became realizable. Every new political theory, by whatever name it called itself, led back to hierarchy and regimentation, with a general hardening outlook that set round 1930, the practices which had long been abandoned, in some cases for hundreds of years, imprisonment without trial, the use of war prisoners as slaves, public executions, torture to extract confections, the use of hostages, and the deportation of whole populations not only became common again, but were tolerated and even defended by people who considered themselves enlightened and progressive. It was only after a decade of national wars, civil wars, revolutions, and counter-revolutions in all parts of the world that Ingsoc and its rivals fully emerged as a fully worked-out political theories. But they had been foreshadowed by various systems generally called totalitarian, which had appeared earlier in the century, and the main outlines of the world which would emerge from the prevailing chaos had long been obvious. What kind of people would control this world had been equally obvious. The new aristocracy was made up for the most part of bureaucrats, scientists, technicians, trade union organizers, publicity experts, sociologists, teachers, journalists, professional politicians. These people whose origins laid in the salaried middle class and the upper grades of the working class have been shaped and brought together by a barren world of monopoly, industry, and centralized government. As compared with their opposite numbers in past ages, they were less avaricious, less tempted by luxury, hungrier for pure power, and above all, more conscious of what they were doing and more intent on crushing opposition. This last difference was cardinal. By comparison with that existing today, all the tyrannies of the past were half-hearted and inefficient. The ruling groups were always affected by some extent liberal ideals, and were content to leave loose ends everywhere, only to regard the overt act to be uninterested in what their subjects were thinking. Even the Catholic Church of the Middle Ages was tolerant by modern standards. Part of the reason for this was that no past government had the power to keep its citizens under constant surveillance. No past government had the ability to keep their citizens under constant surveillance. The invention of print, however, made it easier to manipulate public opinion, and the film and the radio carried the process further. With the development of television and the technical advance which made it possible to receive and transmit simultaneously on the same instrument, private life came to an end. Every citizen, or at least every citizen important enough to be worth watching, could be kept 24 hours a day under the eyes of the police and in the sound of official propaganda, with all other channels of communication closed. The possibility of enforcing not only complete obedience to the will of the state, but complete complete uniformity of opinion on all subjects now existed for the first time. After the revolutionary period of the 50s and 60s, society regrouped itself, as always, into high, middle, and low. But the new high group, unlike its forerunners, did not act upon instinct, but knew what was needed to safeguard the position. It had long been realized that the only secure basis for oligarchy is collectivism. Wealth and privilege are most easily defended when they are possessed jointly. This so-called abolition of private property, which took place in the middle years of the century, meant, in effect, the concentration of property in far fewer hands than before, but with this difference, that the new owners were a group instead of a mass of individuals. Individually, no member of the party owns anything, except petty personal belongings. Collectively, the party owns everything in Oceania, because it controls everything. It disposes of the products as it sees fit. In the years following the revolution, it was able to step into this commanding position almost unopposed, because the whole process was represented as an act of collectivization. It had always been assumed that if the capital class were expropriated, socialism must follow, and unquestionably the capitalists had been expropriated. Factories, mines, land, houses, transport, everything had been taken away from them. And since these things were no longer private property, it followed that they must be public property. Ingsoc, which grew out of the earlier socialist movement and inherited its phraseology, in fact carried out the main item in the socialist program, with the result foreseen, intended beforehand, that economic inequality has been made permanent. But the problems of perpetual hierarchical society go deeper than this. There are only four ways in which a ruling group can fall from power. Either it is conquered from without, or it governs so inefficiently that the masses are stirred to revolt, or it allows a strong and discontented middle group to come into being, or it loses its own self-confidence and willingness to govern. These causes do not operate singly, and as a rule all four of them are present to some degree. A ruling class which could guard against them all would remain in power permanently. Ultimately, the determining factor is the mental attitude of the ruling class itself. After the middle of that present century, the first danger in reality disappeared. Each of the three powers are now completely divide the world, is a fact unconquerable. It could only become conquerable through slow demographic changes, which a government with wide powers can easily avert. The second danger also is a theoretical one. The masses never revolt of their own accord, and they never revolt merely because they are oppressed. Indeed, so long as they are not permitted to have standards of comparison, they never even become aware that they are oppressed. The recurrent economic crises of past times were totally unnecessary and are not now permitted to happen. But other and equally large dislocations can and do happen without having political results, because there is no way in which discontent can become articulate. As for the problem of overproduction, what has been latent in our society since the development of the machine technique, it is solved by a device of continuous warfare, see Chapter 3, which is also useful in keying up public morale to the necessary pitch. From the point of view of our present rulers, therefore, the only genuine dangers are the splitting off of a new group of able, underemployed, power-hungry people, and the growth of liberalism and skepticism in their own ranks. The problem is educational. It is a problem of continuously molding the consciousness of both the directing group and the larger executive group that lies immediately below it. The consciousness of the masses needs only to be influenced in a negative way. Given this background, one could infer, if one did not know it already, the general structure of oceanic society. At the apex of the pyramid comes Big Brother. Big Brother is infallible and all-powerful. Every success, every achievement, every victory, every scientific discovery, every knowledge, all wisdom, all happiness, all virtue are held to issue directly from his leadership and inspiration. Nobody's ever seen Big Brother. He is a face on the hoardings, a voice on the telescreen. We may be reasonably sure that he will never die, and there is already considerable uncertainty as to when he was born. Big Brother is the guise in which the party chooses to exhibit itself to this world. His function is to act as a focusing point for love, fear, and reverence. Emotions are more easily felt toward an individual than toward an organization. Below Big Brother comes the inner party. Its number is limited to 6 millions, or something less than 2% of the population of Oceania. Below the inner party comes the outer party, which, if the inner party is described as the brain of the statue, may just be likened to the hands. Below that come the dumb masses, whom we habitually refer to as the proles, numbering perhaps 85% of the population. In terms of our earlier classification, the proles are the low. For the slave populations of the equatorial lands who pass constantly from conqueror to conqueror are not a permanent or necessary part of the structure. Give me 1 second. Oh, cool. Southside Rakim, he got his car fixed. Woo-woo. Way to go. man. Ooh, moly. Oh, man. Let me check Discord real quick. I don't know what is going on Discord. But we do not need to worry about them. In principle, the membership in these three groups is not hereditary. The child of inter-party parents is in theory not born into the inter-party. Admission to either branch of the party is by examination taken at the age of 16. Nor is there any racial discrimination or any marked domination of one province by another. Jews, Negroes, South Americans of pure Indian blood are to be found in the highest ranks of our party, and the administrators of any area are always drawn from the inhabitants of that area. In no part of Oceania do the inhabitants have the feeling that they are a colonial population ruled from a distant capital. Oceania has no capital, and its titular head is a person whose whereabouts nobody knows, except that English is the chief lingua franca and Newspeak is the official language. It is not centralized in any way. Its rulers are not held together by blood ties, but by adherence to a common doctrine. It is true that our society is stratified, very rigidly stratified, on what at first slightly appear to be hereditary lines. There is far less to and fro movement between the different groups that happened under capitalism or even in the pre-industrial ages. Between the two branches of our party, there is a certain amount of interchange, but only so much as will ensure that weaklings are excluded from the inner party and the ambitious members of the outer party are made harmless by allowing them to rise. Proletarians in practice are not allowed to graduate into the party. The most gifted among them, who might possibly become nuclei of discontent, are simply marked down by the thought police and eliminated. But this state of affairs is not necessarily permanent, nor is it a matter of principle. The party is not a class in the old sense of the word. It does not aim at transmitting power to its own children. As such, if there were no other way to keep the ablest people at the top, it would be perfectly prepared to recruit an entirely new generation from the ranks of the proletariat. In the crucial years, the fact that the party was not a hereditary body did a great deal to neutralize opposition. The older kind of socialists, who have been trained to fight against something called class privilege, assumed that what was not hereditary cannot be permanent. He did not see the continuation of an oligarchy that needed to be physical, nor did he pause to reflect on hereditary aristocracies had always been short-lived, whereas adoptive organizations such as the Catholic Church have sometimes lasted for hundreds or thousands of years. The essence of oligarchical rule is not father-to-son inheritance, but the persistence of a certain worldview and a certain way of life imposed by the dead on the living. A ruling group is a ruling group so long as it can nominate its successors. The party is not concerned with perpetuating its blood, but with perpetuating itself. Who wields the power is not important, provided that the hierarchical structure remains always the same. All the beliefs, habits, tastes, emotions, mental attitudes that characterize our time are really designed to sustain the mystique of the party and prevent the true nature of present-day society from being perceived. Physical rebellion or any preliminary move toward rebellion, it is at present not possible. From the proletarians, nothing is to be feared. Left to themselves, they will continue from generation to generation, from century to century, working, breeding, dying, not without any impulse to rebel, but without the power of grasping that the world could be other than it is. They could only become dangerous if the advance of industrial technique made it necessary to educate them more highly, but since military and commercial rivalry are no longer important, the level of popular education is actually declining. What opinions the masses hold or do not hold is looked on as a matter of indifference. They can be granted intellectual liberty because they have no intellect. In a party member, on the other hand, not even the smallest deviation of opinion on the most unimportant subject can be tolerated. A party member lives from birth to death under the eye of thought police. Even when he is alone, he can never be sure that he is alone. Wherever he may be, asleep or awake, working or resting, in his bath or in bed, he can be inspected without warning or without knowing that he is being inspected. Nothing that he does is indifferent. His friendships, his relaxations, his behavior toward wife and children, the expression of his face when he is alone, the words he mutters in his sleep, even the characteristic movements of his body are all jealously scrutinized. Not only any actual misdemeanor, but any eccentricity, however small, any change of his habits, any nervous mannerism that could be detected. He has no freedom of choice in any direction whatever. On the other hand, his actions are not regulated by law or by any clearly formulated code of behavior. In Oceania, there is no law. Thoughts and actions which, when detected, mean certain death are not formally forbidden, and the endless purges, arrests, tortures, imprisonments, and vaporizations are not inflicted as punishment for crimes which have actually been committed, but are merely the wiping out of persons who might perhaps commit a crime at some time in the future. A party member is required to have not only the right opinions, but the right instincts. Many of the beliefs and attitudes demanded of him are never plainly stated and cannot be stated without laying bare the contradictions inherent in Ingsoc. If he was a person naturally orthodox, in newspeak a good thinker, then he will in all circumstances know, without taking thought, what is the true belief or the desirable emotion. But in any case, an elaborate mental training undergone in childhood and grouping itself round the newspeak words crime stop, black white, and doublethink makes him think unwilling and unable to think too deeply on any subject whatever. A party member is expected to have no private emotions, no respite from enthusiasm. He is supposed to live in a continuous frenzy of hatred of foreign enemies and internal traitors, triumph over victories, self-abasement before power and wisdom of the party. The discontents produced his bare, unsatisfying life are deliberately turned outwards and dissipated by such devices as the 2 minutes hate, and the speculations which might possibly induce a skeptical or rebellious attitude are killed in advance by his acquired inner discipline. The fairest and simplest stage of the discipline, which can be taught even to young children, is called in newspeak crime stop. Crime stop means the facility of stopping short, as though by any instinct, at the threshold of dangerous thought. It includes the power of not grasping analogies or failing to perceive logical errors, the misunderstanding the simplest arguments if they are inimical to insight, and of being bored or repelled by any train of thought which is capable of leading in a heretical direction. Crime stop, in short, means protective stupidity. But stupidity is not enough. On the contrary, orthodoxy in the full sense demands a control over one's own mental processes as complete as that of a contortionist over his body. Oceanic society rests ultimately on the belief that Big Brother is omnipotent and the party is infallible. But since in reality Big Brother is not omnipotent and the party is not infallible, there is a need for unvarying, moment-to-moment flexibility in the treatment of facts. The key word here is black-white. Like so many newspeak words, this word has two mutually contradictory meanings. Applied to an opponent, it means the habit of impudently claiming that black is white, and more to know that black is white, and to forget that one has ever believed the contrary. It demands a continuous altercation of the past be made possible by a system of thought which really embraces all the rest, which is known in newspeak as doublethink. The alteration of the past is necessary for two reasons, one in which is subsidiary and, so to speak, precautionary. The subsidiary reason is that the party member, like the proletarian, tolerates present-day conditions partly because he has no standards of comparison. He must be cut off from the past. Made possible. Uh, he must be cut off from the past. Just as he must be cut off from foreign countries, because it is necessary for him to believe that he is better off than his ancestors, and that the average level of material comfort is constantly rising. But by far the more important reason for the real adjustment of the past is the need for a safeguard of the infallibility of the party. It is not merely that speeches, statistics, and records of every kind must be constantly brought up to date in order to show the predictions of the party were in all cases right. It is also that no change in doctrine or political alignment can ever be admitted, for to change one's mind or even one's policy is confession of weakness. For example, if Eurasia or East Asia, whichever it may be, is the enemy today, then that country must always have been the enemy. And if facts say otherwise, then the facts must be altered. Thus history continuously is rewritten. This day-to-day falsification of the past carried out by the Ministry of Truth is as necessary to the stability of the regime as the work of repression and espionage carried out by the Ministry of Love. Immutability of the past is the central tenet of Ingsoc. Past events, it is argued, have no objective existence, which derive only in written records and human memories. The past is whatever the records and memories agree on. And since the party is in full control of all the records, and equally in full control of all the minds of its members, it follows that the past is whatever the party chooses to make it. It also follows that though the past is alterable, it has never been altered for in any specific instance, for when it has been received in whatever shape is needed in the moment, this new version is the past. There is no different past that could have ever existed. This holds good even when, as has often happened, the same event has been altered out of recognition several times in the course of the year. At all times the party is in possession of absolute truth, and clearly the absolute can never have been different from what it is now. It will be seen that the control of the past depends, above all, on the training of memory, to make sure that all written records agree with the orthodoxy of the movement. It is merely a mechanical act, but it is also necessary to remember that events happen in the desired manner. And if it is necessary to rearrange one's memories or to tamper with written records, then it is necessary to forget that one has done so. The trick of doing this can be learned by any other mental technique. It is learned by a majority of party members, and certainly by all who are intelligent as well as orthodox. In old speak, it is called, quite frankly, reality control. In new speak, it is called doublethink, although doublethink comprises much else as well. Doublethink means holding the power of two contradictory beliefs in one's mind simultaneously and accepting both of them. The party intellectual knows in which direction memories must be altered. He therefore knows that he is playing tricks with reality. With the exercise of doublethink, he also satisfies himself that reality was not violated. The process has to be conscious, or it would not be carried out by sufficient precision, but it also has to be unconscious, or it would bring with it a feeling of falsity and hence of guilt. Doublethink lies at the very heart of Ingsoc, and since the essential act of the party is to use its conscious deception while retaining the firmness of purpose that goes with complete honesty, to deliberate lies while genuinely believing in them, to forget any fact that has become inconvenient, and then, when it becomes necessary again, to draw it back from oblivion for just so long as needed, to deny the existence of objective reality, and all the while to take account of reality which one denies. All this is indispensably necessary. Even in using the word doublethink, it is necessary to exercise doublethink. For by using the word one admits that he is tampering with reality. By a fresh act of doublethink, one erases this knowledge, and so on indefinitely, with the lie always one leap ahead of the truth. Ultimately, it is by means of doublethink that the party has been able, and may, for all we know, continue to be able for thousands of years, to arrest the course of history. All past oligarchies have fallen from power either because they ossified or because they grew soft. Either they became stupid and arrogant, failed to adjust themselves to changing circumstances, and were overthrown, or they became liberal and cowardly and made concessions when they should have used force, and once again were overthrown. They fell, that is to say, either through consciousness or through unconsciousness. It is the achievement of the party to produce a system of thought in which both conditions can exist simultaneously. And upon no other intellectual basis could the domination of the party be made permanent. If one is to rule and to continue ruling, one must be able to dislocate the sense of reality, for the secret of rulership is to combine a belief in one's own infallibility with the power to learn from past mistakes. It need hardly be said that the subtlest practitioners of doublethink are those who invented doublethink and know it is a vast system of mental cheating. In our society, those who have the best knowledge of what is happening are also those who are the furthest from seeing the world as it is. In general, the greater the understanding, the greater the delusion, the more intelligent, the less sane. Mhm. One clear illustration of this is the fact that war hysteria increases in intensity as one rises in the social scale. Those whose attitudes toward the war are most nearly rational are the subject peoples of the disputed territories. To these people the war is simply a continuous calamity which sweeps to and fro over their bodies like a tidal wave. Which side is winning is a matter of complete indifference to them. They are aware that a change in overlordship simply means that they will be doing the same work as before for new masters who treat them the same way as the old ones. Slightly more favored workers, whom we call the proles, are only intermittently conscious of the war. It is necessary that they can be prodded into frenzies of fear and hatred, but when left to themselves they are capable of forgetting for long periods that the war is happening. It is in the ranks of the party, and above all the inner party, that the true war enthusiasm is found. World conquest is believed in most firmly by those who know it to be impossible. This peculiar linking together of opposites, knowledge with ignorance, cynicism with fanaticism, is the one chief distinguishing mark of oceanic society. The official ideology abounds with contradictions, even when there is no practical reason for them. Thus the party rejects and vilifies every principle for which the socialist movement originally stood, and chooses to do this in the name of socialists. It preaches a contempt for the working class, unexampled for centuries past, and addresses its members in a uniform which was at one time peculiar to manual workers, and was adopted for that reason. It systematically undermines the solidarity of the family and calls its leader by a name which is a direct appeal to the sentiment of family loyalty. Even the names of the four ministries by which we are governed exhibit a sort of impudence in their deliberate reversal of the facts. The Ministry of Peace concerns itself with war, the Ministry of Truth with lies, the Ministry of Love with torture, and the Ministry of Plenty with starvation. These contradictions are not accidental, nor do they result from ordinary hypocrisy. They are deliberate exercises in doublethink, for it is only by reconciling contradictions that power can be retained indefinitely. In no other way could the ancient cycle be broken. If human equality is to be forever averted, if the high, as we have called them, are to keep their places permanently, then the prevailing mental condition must be controlled insanity. But there is one question which until this moment we have almost ignored. It is why? Why should human equality be averted? Supposing the mechanics of the process have been rightly described, what is the motive for this huge accurately planned effort to freeze history in a particular moment of time. Here we reach the central secret. As we have seen, the mystique of the party and above all the inner party depends on doublethink. But deeper than this lies the original motive, the never questioned instinct that first led to the seizure of power and brought doublethink, the thought police, continuous warfare, and all the other necessary paraphernalia into existence afterwards. This motive really consists. Winston became aware of silence, as one becomes aware of a new sound. It seemed to him that Julia had been very still for some time past. She was lying on her side, naked from the waist upwards, with her cheek pillowed on her hand, and one dark lock tumbling across her eye. The rest rose and fell slowly and regularly. "Julia!" No answer. "Julia, are you awake?" No answer. She was asleep. He shut the book, put it carefully on the floor, lay down, and pulled the coverlid over both of them. He had still, he reflected, not learned the ultimate secret. He understood how, but he did not understand why. Chapter 1 and Chapter 3 had not actually told him anything that he didn't already know. They merely systemized the knowledge that he possessed already, but after reading it, he knew better than before that he was not mad. Being in a minority, even a minority of one, didn't make you mad. There was truth and there was untruth. If you clung to truth, even against the whole world, you were not mad. A yellow beam from the sinking sun slanted in through the window and fell across the pillow. He shut his eyes. The sun on his face, the girl's smooth body touching his own, gave him a strong, sleepy, confident feeling. He was safe. Everything was all right. He fell asleep, murmuring, "Sanity is not statistical," and with the feeling that this remark contained in it a profound wisdom. Oh, man. We're doing pretty good, y'all. We're doing really good. I think we'll do one more chapter, because that's the end of this part. And then we can get into part 3 next time. So, chapter 10, part 2, chapter 10. When he awoke, it was with the sensation of having slept for a long time, but the glance at the old-fashioned clock told him that it was only 20:30. 20:30? Oh, yeah, like 8:30, okay. He lay dozing for a little while, then it was usually deep-lunged singing struck up from the yard below. "It was only an hopeless fancy. You pass you can eat joy. But you can wait in dreams I stood. Life stole me all the while." The driveling song seemed to have kept its popularity. You still heard it all over the place. It outlived the hate song. Julia woke at the sound, stretched herself luxuriously, and got out of bed. "I'm hungry," she said. "Let's make some more coffee. Damn, the stove's gone out and the water's cold." She put the stove up and shook it. "There's no oil in it." "I can get some remote Carrington, I expect." "The funny thing is I made sure it was full. I was going to put my clothes on," she added. "It seemed to have got colder." Winston also got up and dressed himself. The indefatigable voice sings on. "Days I time all things I say you can always forget. But the smiles that tears across the years, they twist me strings yet." As he fastened the belt of his overalls, he strode across to the window. Sun must have gone down behind his houses. It was not shining into the yard any longer. Flagstones were wet, though they had just been washed. He had a feeling that the sky had been washed too. So fresh and pale was the blue between the chimney pots. Tirelessly the woman marched to and fro, corking and uncorking herself, singing and falling silent, pegging out more diapers, and more and yet more. He wondered whether she took in washing for a living, or was merely the slave to 20 or 30 grandchildren. Julia came across to his side. Together they gazed down with a sort of fascination at the sturdy figure below. As he looked at the woman in her uncharacteristic attitude, her thick arms reaching up for the line, her powerful mare-like buttocks protruding, it struck him for the first time that she was beautiful. It never before occurred to him That the body of a woman of 50 blown up to monstrous dimensions by childbearing, then hardened, roughened by work till it was coarse in the grain like an overripe turnip, could be beautiful. But it was so, after all. And he thought, why not? Sordid old contourless body, like a block of granite, and the rasping red skin bore the same relation to the body of a girl as the rose-hip to the rose. Why should the fruit be held inferior to the flower? She's beautiful, he murmured. She's a meter across the hips easily, said Julia. That's her style of beauty, said Winston. He held Julia's waist easily encircled by his arm. From the hip to the knee her flank was against his. Out of their bodies no children would ever come. That was the one thing they could never do. Only by word of mouth, from mind to mind, could they ever pass on the secret. The woman down there had no mind. She only had strong arms, a warm heart, and a fertile belly. He wondered how many children she'd given birth to. It might have easily been 15. She had a momentarily flowering, a year perhaps of wild rose beauty, and then she had suddenly swollen like a fertilized fruit, grown hard and red and coarse. And her life had been laundering, scrubbing, darning, cooking, sweeping, polishing, mending, scrubbing, laundering. First for children, then for grandchildren, over 30 unbroken years. At the end of it, she was still singing. The mystical reverence that he felt for her was somehow mixed up with the aspect of pale, cloudless sky stretching away behind the chimney pots and into interminable distances. It was curious to think that the sky was the same for everybody, in Eurasia or East Asia as well as here. And people under the sky were also very much the same. Everywhere, all over the world, hundreds or thousands of millions of people just like us, people ignorant of one another's existence, held apart by walls of hatred and lies, yet almost exactly the same. People who had never learned to think, but who were storing up in their hearts, bellies, and muscles the power that would one day overturn the world. There was hope, and it lay in the proles. Without having read to the end of the book, he knew that must be Goldstein's final message. The future belonged to the proles. And he could be sure that when their time came, the world they constructed would not be just as alien to him. Winston Smith as the world of the party. Yeah, because at least it would be a world of sanity. Where there is equality, there can be sanity. Sooner or later it would happen. Strength would change into consciousness. The proles were immortal. You could not doubt it when you looked at the valiant figure in the yard. The end of their awakening would come. And until that happened, though it might be 1,000 years, they would stay alive against the odds like birds, passing on from body to body the vitality which the party did not share and could not kill. You remember, he said, that thrush that sang to us the first day at the edge of the wood. He wasn't singing to us, said Julia. He was singing to please himself. Not even that, he was just singing. The birds sang, the proles sang, the party did not sing. All around the world, in London and New York and Africa and Brazil, and in the mysterious forbidden lands beyond the frontiers, in the streets of Paris and Berlin, in the villages of the endless Russian plain, in the bazaars of China and Japan, everywhere stood the same solid, unconquerable figure, made monstrous by work and childbearing, toiling from birth to death and still singing. Out of those mighty loins a race, consciousness, beings must one day come. You were the dead. Theirs is the future. But you could share in the future if you kept alive the mind as they kept alive the body, and passed the secret doctrine of 2 + 2 make 4. We are the dead, he said. We are the dead, echoed Julia dutifully.
You are the dead,
An iron voice said behind them. They sprang apart. Winston's entrails seemed to have turned into ice. He could see the white all around the irises of Julia's eyes. Her face had turned a milky yellow. A smear of rouge that was still on each cheekbone showed out sharply, almost as though unconnected with the skin beneath.
You are the dead,
repeated the iron voice. It was behind the picture, breathed Julia.
It was behind the picture, said the voice. Remain exactly where you are. Make no movement until you are ordered.
It was starting. It was starting at last. They could do nothing except stand gazing into each other's eyes. To run for life to get out of the house before it was too late, no such thought occurred to them. Unthinkable to disobey the iron voice from the wall. There was a snap as though the catch had been turned back, and the crash of breaking glass. The picture had fallen to the floor, uncovering the telescreen behind it. "Now they can see us," said Julia.
Now we can see you, said the voice. Stand in the middle of the room. Stand back to back. Clasp your heads behind your heads. Do not touch one another.
They were not touching, but it seemed to him that he could feel Julia's body shaking, or perhaps it was merely the shaking of his own. He could just stop his teeth from chattering, but his knees were beyond control. There was the sound of trampling brutes below. Inside the house and outside the yard seemed to be full of men. Something was being dragged across the stones. The woman singing had stopped abruptly. There was a long rolling clang as though the washtub had been flung across the yard, then a confusion of angry shouts, which ended in a yell of pain. "The house is surrounded," said Winston.
The house is surrounded,
said the voice. He heard Julia snap her teeth together. "I suppose we may as well say goodbye," she said.
You may as well say goodbye,
said the voice. And then another quite different voice, a thin, cultivated voice in which Winston had the impression of having heard before, struck in.
And by the way, while we are on the subject, here comes a candle to light you to bed, and here comes a chopper to chop off your head.
Something crashed into the bed behind Winston's back. The head of a ladder had just been thrust through the window and had burst through the frame. Someone was climbing through the window. There was a stampede of boots up the stairs. The room was full of solid men in black uniforms with iron-shod boots on their feet and truncheons in their hands. Winston was not yet trembling any longer. His eyes barely moved. One thing alone mattered: to keep still. To keep still and not give them an excuse to hit you. A man with a smooth prize fighter's jowl, in which the mouth was only a slit, paused opposite him, balancing his truncheon meditatively between his thumb and forefinger. Winston met his eyes the feeling of nakedness, with one's hands behind one's head, and one's face and body all exposed. It was almost unbearable. The man protruded the tip of the white tongue, licked the place where his lips should have been, and then passed on. There was another crash. Someone had picked up the glass paperweight from the table and smashed it into the pieces on the hearthstone. A fragment of coral, a tiny crackle of pink, and a sugar rosebud from the cake rolled across the mat. How small, thought Winston, how small it always was. There was a gasp and a thump behind him, and he received a violent kick on the ankle which nearly flung him off his balance. One of the men had smashed his fist into Julia's solar plexus, doubling her up like a pocket ruler. She was thrashing about on the floor, fighting for breath. Winston dared not turn his head even by a millimeter, but sometimes her livid, gasping face came within the angle of his vision. Even in his terror, it was as though he could feel the pain in his own body, the deadly pain which nevertheless was less urgent than the struggle to get back her breath. He knew what it was like, the terrible, agonizing pain which they were all while, but it could not be suffered yet, because before all else it was necessary to be able to breathe. Then the two men hoisted her up by her knees and shoulders and carried her out of the room like a sack. Winston had a glimpse of her face upside down, yellow and contorted, with eyes shut and still a smear of rouge on either cheek. That was the last he saw of her. He stood dead still. No one hit him yet. Thoughts which came of their own accord but seemed totally uninteresting began to flirt through his mind. He wondered whether they had got Mr. Charrington. He wondered what they had done to the woman in the yard. He noticed he badly wanted to urinate and felt a faint surprise because he had done so only 2 or 3 hours ago. He noticed that the clock on the mantelpiece said 9, meaning 21, but the light seemed too strong. Would not the light be fading at 21 hours on an August evening? He wondered whether, after all, he and Julia had mistaken the time. He slept the clock round and thought it was 20:30, when really it was not 8:30 on the following morning. But he did not pursue the thought further. It was not interesting. There was another lighter step in the passage. Mr. Charrington came into the room. The demeanor of the black uniformed men suddenly became more subdued. Something had also changed in Mr. Charrington's appearance. His eyes fell on the fragments of the glazed paperweight. "Pick up those pieces," he said sharply. The man stooped to avoid. His Cockney accent disappeared. Winston suddenly realized whose voice it was he had heard a few moments ago on the telescreen. Mr. Charrington was still wearing his old velvet jacket. His hair, which had been almost white, had turned black. Also, he was not wearing his spectacles. He gave Winston a single sharp glance, as though terrifying his identity, and then paid no more attention to him. He was still recognizable, but he was not the same person any longer. His body had straightened and seemed to have grown bigger. His face had undergone only tiny changes that had nevertheless worked a complete transformation. The black eyebrows were less bushy, the wrinkles gone. The whole lines on the face seemed to have altered. Even the nose seemed shorter. It was the alert, cold face of a man about 35. It occurred to Winston that for the first time in his life he was looking with knowledge at a member of the thought police. Wow. That's the end of part 2. And then, yeah, about 100 pages left. Thank you so much for showing up, everybody. Shouts out to Octawave. I still don't know if it's safe to have sub for sub in the title. Oh, shouts out Anderson Township Library. Shouts out the fine folks over at the r/alternate history hub Discord server. Mad love going out to Against the World G, as well as Rakeem, Brittany, Marie, Don't Watch Continue, Dark Rose. Man, it's a lot of other people too. But it's been 3 hours and 22 minutes. I got a couple things I gotta do with this library still. Then I'm done. So I guess thank you very much for showing up and showing out, being awesome. Thanks for smashing that like button, Octawave. Man. Appreciate everyone so much for always supporting me. Hope you'll have a great rest of your evening. One love, both faith and FA.